Overdefinition overload. Imagine a simple idea, something you could explain in a single breath. Perhaps the meaning of a word, the purpose of a tool, or the heart of a story. But then, layer after layer, clarification after clarification, condition after condition, this idea begins to suffocate beneath its own weight. What was once clear is now buried in a thicket of definitions so complex, so over-engineered, that the original point becomes unrecognizable. This is the phenomenon of overdefinition overload, where precision collapses into confusion and meaning dissolves into a haze of excessive explanation. At first, it seems harmless. Someone asks a question, and the responder wants to be thorough. They begin by giving a definition, then another, then expanding on exceptions, caveats, and the context where the definition fails. Soon, the answer resembles not clarity but a labyrinth. Every doorway opens into another hallway of terms, every wall marked by footnotes and disclaimers. The listener, instead of walking away with understanding, walks away disoriented, carrying fragments of technical jargon that no longer form a coherent whole. Consider how we define something as basic as time. In casual speech, we know what time is, the ticking of a clock, the rising of the sun, the rhythm of a day. But try to capture it scientifically, and suddenly we drown in competing definitions. Time is entropy. Time is a fourth dimension of space-time. Time is perception. Time is a relational measure between changing states. Each definition, meant to illuminate, piles on top of the other until the essence of time feels lost. You asked what time is. You walk away more uncertain than when you began. This is the trap of overdefinition, a hunger for precision so extreme that clarity is sacrificed. It happens in philosophy, where arguments stretch across hundreds of pages, splitting a single concept into endless subcategories until the idea is no longer recognizable. It happens in law, where contracts balloon with definitions and exceptions so detailed that even lawyers argue about what the document means. And it happens in everyday life, when someone explains the rules of a simple board game for 30 minutes, drowning their friends in technicalities, until the joy of playing vanishes. The paradox is that overdefinition often begins with good intentions. People fear being misunderstood, so they reach for more words. They worry about loopholes, so they add more clauses. They anticipate counterarguments, so they preemptively defend every angle. But like a chef who keeps adding spices to make the dish perfect, the result is an overcooked stew where no flavor survives. The original meaning, simple, fresh, direct, is lost beneath the seasonings of endless clarification. Think about the way dictionaries sometimes work. You look up a word, and the definition refers you to another word, which then sends you to yet another, until you find yourself trapped in a spiral of language referring back to itself. The word you wanted to understand is gone, dissolved into a web of circular definitions. You drown not in ignorance, but in the abundance of attempted explanation. In the digital age, this problem magnifies. Online forums, academic papers, corporate manuals, they all tend toward expansion, toward over-explanation, because the space feels infinite. Why give a concise answer when you can give a 1,000-word essay? Why explain simply when you can appear authoritative with technical jargon and complex structures? But authority without clarity is a mask. It intimidates, but it doesn't enlighten. It leaves the listener impressed by the speaker's vocabulary, yet confused about the subject itself. A historical example makes this clearer. Medieval theologians debated endlessly about the nature of angels. How many could dance on the head of a pin, whether their essence was corporeal or incorporeal, what rank existed among the choirs. Each layer of definition was meant to sharpen the truth, but instead, it created a labyrinth of scholastic arguments that consumed lifetimes while leaving the central mystery unsolved. The angels became less divine beings and more pawns in an intellectual maze. Overdefinition transformed wonder into paralysis. Or take modern bureaucracy. Consider tax codes, which could, in principle, be explained simply: a percentage of your income is collected. But open the official documents and you are buried under thousands of pages, cross-references, and exceptions. Each new clause was introduced to clarify, yet the accumulation creates a swamp. Citizens don't feel enlightened, they feel trapped, lost in paperwork. Overdefinition has shifted the system from clarity to confusion, from guidance to obstruction. Even in personal identity, we encounter this overload. People try to define themselves so precisely, listing every preference, label, micro-identity, exception, that the essence of who they are becomes harder, not easier, to grasp. Instead of offering understanding, the overload of definition builds walls, separating rather than connecting. The attempt to explain every nuance ends up obscuring the simple, beating heart of a person's humanity. The deeper danger of overdefinition overload is that it creates the illusion of understanding while leaving the truth obscured. It's like piling bricks higher and higher in an attempt to reach the sky, without realizing that the foundation is sinking. Each added detail feels like progress, but the structure becomes heavier, wobblier, more fragile. Eventually, it collapses under its own complexity. Ask yourself, how many times have you read instructions that left you more confused than before? How many times has a simple question spiraled into a sea of specialized terms, each demanding its own glossary? How many times have you felt your mind glaze over, not because the subject was too profound, but because it was explained to death? Clarity is not born from the number of words we use, but from their precision and restraint. The power of a definition lies in its ability to reveal essence, not bury it. When definitions multiply endlessly, they do not bring us closer to truth, they push us further away. Overdefinition overload is not knowledge. It is noise disguised as knowledge. In the end, the antidote is simplicity. To dare to cut through the thicket and speak plainly. To risk being slightly incomplete rather than overwhelmingly incomprehensible. To honor the original idea by protecting its clarity, not drowning it under the weight of words. For meaning is fragile, and in our hunger to refine it, we can just as easily destroy it. Circular logic trap. Imagine standing inside a hall of mirrors. No matter where you turn, you see your own reflection staring back. Each angle seems to offer a new view, yet every path folds into itself. That is the essence of the circular logic trap, a reasoning pattern that feeds on itself, looping endlessly, until no outside perspective can break through. It is a self-defending prison built out of words, a fortress where every counterargument is quietly absorbed into the same cycle, leaving you with the illusion of certainty but none of its substance. You are not convinced by evidence. You are convinced by the endless echo of the same idea bouncing back at you. Consider the phrase, "This statement is true because it says it is true." It sounds absurd, yet when stretched into real-life reasoning, it becomes far less obvious. A preacher declaring that sacred scripture must be divine because the scripture itself says so. A leader proclaiming they are trustworthy because they say they are trustworthy. A conspiracy theory insisting it must be real precisely because powerful people deny it. Each of these forms a loop. The conclusion is treated as evidence for itself, and the argument becomes unassailable not because it is strong, but because it has closed every possible exit. Circular logic thrives where people are desperate for certainty. Imagine a frightened society seeking safety. A ruler claims authority because they were chosen by destiny. How do we know they were chosen by destiny? Because they are the ruler. The logic doubles back, swallowing its own tail, much like the ancient serpent symbol, the Ouroboros, that devours itself to sustain itself. To question the logic is to already be trapped inside it, because the system is designed to reject anything external as invalid. Think of debates in which someone says, "The law is just because it is the law." No deeper moral reasoning, no exploration of right and wrong. Only the assumption that following the law is good simply because the law exists. Another example is the doctrine of certain institutions. Our teachings are true because they come from the truth. The very foundation relies on itself, a snake biting its tail, ensuring that no external critique can break it. This makes circular logic one of the most enduring tools of control. It cannot be disproved from within, because the framework refuses to acknowledge anything that does not already affirm it. Psychologists have observed how circular reasoning functions like a cognitive comfort zone. It simplifies the chaos of the world by sealing people inside a closed explanation. Imagine someone believing, "I cannot fail because I am destined to succeed, and my success proves I was destined." If they stumble, the failure is reinterpreted as a test, which further strengthens the original belief. The trap does not break, it adapts. weaving contradictions back into its cycle. The person feels validated no matter what happens, even as they blind themselves to genuine reflection. Even in everyday life, we encounter this trap. A parent might say, "Because I'm your parent, I know what's best." And the proof that I know what's best is simply that I am your parent. The authority of the role becomes both the premise and the conclusion. In politics, circular logic is used to silence dissent. Our system works because it is the system we use, and because it works, it must continue. Anyone questioning it is dismissed, because the very act of questioning is seen as proof of disloyalty. The circle does not allow cracks. It repairs them by folding the doubt back into the cycle. But why does this matter? Because circular logic prevents growth, truth, and deeper understanding. Imagine if science had remained trapped inside such a loop. The Earth is the center of the universe because everything revolves around the Earth. And because everything revolves around the Earth, it must be the center. Had no one broken this circle, humanity would never have reached beyond its sky. Circular reasoning resists evolution, and it holds entire civilizations hostage in illusions of certainty. It is the enemy of progress disguised as the voice of truth. One of the most haunting aspects of circular logic is how seductive it feels. People caught inside it feel safe. The circle protects them from doubt, confusion, or the terrifying abyss of not knowing. But safety inside a loop is an illusion. It is like walking forever inside a locked garden. Beautiful, yes, but ultimately limiting. The world outside, vast and unknown, becomes unreachable. And so the trap thrives, not because it is strong, but because it convinces you there is no need to leave. That is its genius. It makes captivity feel like comfort. To break free from this trap requires an act of radical courage. It means stepping outside the loop and asking, but what if the conclusion is wrong? What if the proof I'm being offered is no proof at all? It means daring to see beyond the mirror, to look for foundations that do not depend on themselves. True reasoning should extend outward, touching evidence, observation, and independent validation. Only then does thought breathe freely again. Without this, we remain trapped in circles, forever debating, forever returning to the same point, mistaking movement for progress. Circular logic is not just a flaw of argument, it is a cage of the mind. It traps governments, religions, communities, and even individuals in endless repetition. But once you see it, once you recognize the hall of mirrors for what it is, you cannot unsee it. You realize how fragile it truly is, how desperately it relies on its own reflection to survive. And in that realization lies the key to escape, the understanding that truth must reach beyond itself, that real answers live outside the circle, waiting for those brave enough to walk beyond its endless walls. Selective data flood. Imagine someone showing you a mountain of charts, graphs, and statistics. So many numbers you feel as though the truth must be buried inside. But what if the flood of information isn't meant to reveal reality, but to hide it? This is the tactic of selective data flooding, presenting favorable data in overwhelming amounts, while quietly burying contradictory evidence in irrelevant or distracting figures. It's not a lie in the traditional sense. It's more dangerous. It's the illusion of transparency. You feel as though you've seen everything, when in fact, you've been led through a maze designed to keep you from the one door that mattered. Think of a politician giving a speech about economic growth. They may talk endlessly about rising GDP, record stock market highs, and new job creation. Slide after slide, chart after chart, all pointing upward. The audience nods, reassured. But what isn't said? The stagnant wages, the rising inequality, the number of people working 2 jobs just to afford rent. Those numbers exist, but they're hidden beneath the avalanche of good news statistics. By the end of the presentation, the audience feels informed, but they've actually been blinded by excess. This is how selective data flooding functions, not by concealing data, but by drowning you in it until you cannot tell signal from noise. It's a strategy you can find everywhere, from corporate boardrooms to courtrooms. Imagine a company accused of harming the environment. In their defense, they present a 500-page report filled with colorful graphs showing reductions in emissions, community investments, and recycling initiatives. Every page looks like progress. Yet buried on page 472, in a footnote, is the admission that one of their factories leaked toxic waste into a river for years. That single fact outweighs all the glossy pages before it, but you're already exhausted, your mind numbed by numbers and feel-good charts. By the time you reach it, your ability to process has already been drained. The contradiction is present, but invisible. Psychologists know this as cognitive overload. When our brains are bombarded with too much information, we stop processing critically and begin to rely on shortcuts. We trust the presenter. We assume if the data looks professional, it must be true. We confuse quantity with quality. And this is where the trap is strongest, because selective data flooding doesn't rely on deception alone. It relies on our own mental limits. It plays with the fact that humans are finite processors of information. Drown us in the ocean of numbers, and we will cling to whatever island of clarity is offered, even if it's the wrong one. History offers chilling examples. During the Cold War, governments regularly used this method to shape public perception. Reports about military spending were padded with endless details. Contracts, subcontracts, missile counts, regional deployments, all technically true. But the larger question, was this spending actually making people safer, or just escalating an arms race, was buried. Citizens felt informed by the sheer weight of statistics, when in reality they were being guided away from the deeper truth. The flood became the fog. In business, selective data flooding is common in marketing. A company selling a new diet pill may bombard potential buyers with dozens of studies. They'll highlight numbers about average weight loss or percentage of satisfied customers. But those studies are carefully chosen. A trial where the pill failed to work as advertised? It's included too, but hidden among dozens of favorable ones, cited only once, reduced to a statistic that looks small next to the louder numbers. By presenting everything, but emphasizing selectively, they create an illusion of balance while leading you toward only one conclusion, the one they want you to believe. Even science, which prides itself on transparency, is not immune. Consider medical research funded by corporations. A pharmaceutical company may conduct 50 studies on a new drug. Perhaps only 10 show favorable results. Those 10 will be released in journals, discussed in press conferences, highlighted in advertising. The other 40 don't vanish completely. They may be published quietly, with results hidden in dense technical appendices, but they are buried in such a way that few will ever see them. Doctors and patients alike end up believing the drug is effective because the favorable data is everywhere, while the contradictory data has been suffocated under mountains of less relevant statistics. The psychological impact is profound. Once people are convinced they've seen all the data, they feel immune to manipulation. They'll say, "I looked at the facts myself." But what they looked at was not the full picture. It was a curated flood. The contradiction wasn't erased, it was drowned. And in that drowning lies the true danger. A belief that you're making rational, informed choices when in fact you've been shepherded to a conclusion. Think about your own life. How many times have you been swayed by an argument not because it was strong, but because it was long? How many times have you accepted claims because they came with charts and statistics too numerous to challenge? The truth is, selective data flooding works because most of us don't have the time or energy to sift through every detail. We trust summaries. We trust emphasis. And those who know this exploit it mercilessly. The tactic thrives in the modern world, where data is everywhere. Politicians flood you with numbers about crime rates while hiding the fact that those rates are cherry-picked. Corporations drown you in quarterly reports while slipping inconvenient truths into fine print. Media outlets bombard you with endless figures, graphs, and expert opinions, but only on one side of the story. The contradiction is always there. It just doesn't get the same spotlight. The scariest part is this: selective data flooding doesn't require lies. It only requires imbalance. Too much of one thing, too little of another. An ocean of irrelevant truth to conceal a single devastating fact. And because the data is technically present, those who wield this tactic can always claim innocence. We didn't hide anything. It was in the report. And they're right, it was. But it was hidden in plain sight, buried under the weight of distraction. To resist this trap, one must learn to ask, not only what is being shown, but what is being hidden. Not how much data is here, but where is the silence? Because in the flood, silence drowns. The contradiction remains, gasping for air beneath an ocean of numbers that appear comforting but conceal a more disturbing reality. And if you don't stop to search for what's buried, you'll walk away certain that you know the truth, when in fact, you've been carried along by a carefully constructed tide of half-truths. The next time you are presented with a flood of statistics, remember, water can quench thirst, but it can also drown. Data can reveal truth, but it can also bury it. And the difference lies not in the numbers themselves, but in who chooses how they are arranged and what they hope you never notice. Over-explaining simplicity. Imagine something as simple as a glass of water. Clear, refreshing, essential. You know exactly what it is. You drink it, and it sustains you. Yet, when we over-explain simplicity, that glass of water doesn't remain water anymore. Instead, it becomes a liquid medium composed primarily of two hydrogen atoms covalently bonded to a single oxygen atom, capable of existing in multiple states depending on molecular vibration, subject to atmospheric pressure fluctuations, and critical for the biochemical homeostasis of carbon-based organisms. By the time you finish hearing that, you're no longer thirsty, you're exhausted. This is the trap of over-explaining simplicity, taking something direct, obvious, and useful, and suffocating it beneath unnecessary layers until its very essence disappears. Why does this happen? Sometimes it's arrogance disguised as intellect. A person may feel that simple truths are too ordinary, too plain, so they dress them up in endless elaboration. Other times it's fear, a fear of being wrong, of seeming shallow, of leaving no room for challenge. So every angle is covered, every word weighed down with disclaimers and clarifications until clarity itself drowns. In both cases, the outcome is the same. Instead of sharpening understanding, complexity becomes a smokescreen. You've probably seen this in classrooms, where a teacher is asked a straightforward question, "What's gravity?" A simple answer could be, "It's the force that pulls objects toward each other." But instead, the explanation swells into a labyrinth about space-time curvature, mathematical tensors, quantum fluctuations, and cosmological constants. While these details are scientifically valid, they don't answer the heart of the question. The child walks away not enlightened, but alienated. This is how the seed of curiosity dies, not from lack of answers, but from answers buried under too much weight. In daily life, over-explaining simplicity becomes a tactic. Politicians are masters of this. Ask a yes or no question, and instead of clarity, you receive a tidal wave of context, history, statistics, half-relevant anecdotes, and rehearsed talking points. What could have been said in one sentence is stretched into paragraphs of fog. The technique works because people assume that a long, complicated explanation must be intelligent, must be trustworthy. But in truth, it's often a way to dodge, to obscure, or to manipulate. The core message gets lost, and the audience is left too weary to challenge it. Think about relationships. A partner asks, "Do you love me?" The simplest answer, and the most powerful, is yes. But imagine someone saying, "Well, love as a concept is multifaceted, layered with emotional, psychological, and even biochemical foundations. My actions demonstrate certain aspects of affection, though at times those actions may be interpreted differently, depending on your perception. And if we define love as consistency, devotion, and care, then I'd say, yes, perhaps." The honesty of the answer doesn't matter anymore. It's been suffocated. What should have been warmth turns into distance. Over-explaining kills intimacy just as surely as it kills clarity. In philosophy, this trap is endless. Simple ideas, like be kind or live in the present, get twisted into volumes of arguments, counterarguments, and metaphysical dissection. Of course, depth has its place, but when depth becomes a cage, simplicity is lost. Ancient Stoics knew this. Epictetus could condense the essence of freedom into a sentence. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it. Imagine if he'd written 10 scrolls breaking down every hypothetical variation. That single line wouldn't have echoed through centuries. The power of simplicity lies in its directness. Over-explaining makes the profound invisible. The irony is that complexity often masquerades as intelligence, when in truth, simplicity is harder to achieve. Albert Einstein once said, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." He didn't mean you should dumb it down. He meant that mastery reveals itself in clarity. Complexity may impress in the moment, but simplicity lingers in memory. The over-explainer might look brilliant, but the one who can distill truth into its essence holds real wisdom. Think of how marketing works. When you see a campaign that says, "Just do it," or "Think different," the message hits hard because it's clean, direct, and undeniable. Now imagine those same slogans rewritten with over-explaining. Undertake physical activity to achieve your goals despite obstacles, or adopt unconventional approaches to cognitive problem solving. Do they inspire you, or do they make you yawn? That's the danger of layering what doesn't need layers. The spark is smothered. But here's the darker edge. Over-explaining simplicity is also a form of control. By wrapping the obvious in jargon, by turning the straight path into a maze, those in power keep others dependent. If the truth is made to seem complex, you'll always need a guide, an interpreter, an authority. Legal documents, technical manuals, financial statements. How often are they written in ways that intimidate rather than inform? The complexity isn't accidental. It's a shield. If you can't see the simple truth, you can't question it. At its core, over-explaining simplicity steals time, clarity, and trust. It forces people to work harder than necessary for truths that should be accessible. It leaves audiences drained, students confused, partners frustrated, and societies distracted. All for the illusion that more words mean more meaning, when in reality, the more words we pile onto the simple, the less of it survives. So the next time you encounter something simple, ask yourself, is the added complexity truly necessary, or is it camouflage? If the idea can stand in its bare form, let it stand. If a yes can suffice, say yes. If a truth can be captured in a single sentence, let it breathe in that form. Because simplicity doesn't need adornment. It is already enough. And when you recognize the trap of over-explaining, you begin to see the power in cutting away the excess, in finding the essence, in daring to be clear when the world thrives on obscurity. This is the paradox. To explain simply is to embrace depth. To over-explain is to betray it. And when you see that difference, you stop mistaking noise for wisdom, and you learn to drink the water for what it is, clear, pure, and life itself. Micro-detail distraction. Imagine this. You walk into a debate, or a boardroom, or even a late-night argument online. The topic is something big: climate change, government corruption, corporate fraud, a relationship falling apart. But suddenly, instead of addressing the heart of the matter, someone zeroes in on a micro-detail. Not the system itself, not the core issue, but the font size on a report, the exact shade of green in a chart, a single typo in a 1,000-page document. And as they talk, as they dissect, as they obsess, the room forgets what really mattered. This is the power of the micro-detail distraction. A sleight of hand. A magician's trick performed not with smoke and mirrors, but with magnifying glasses and obsessive focus. At its core, the micro-detail distraction is a strategy of evasion. When a truth feels too heavy, when accountability looms too large, it's easier to bury everyone in the weeds. History is littered with these examples. In the 1970s, when tobacco companies were facing undeniable evidence that smoking caused cancer, they didn't argue the entire mountain of evidence. They argued over tiny methodological details. They questioned the width of error margins. They highlighted tiny inconsistencies in statistical models. They pushed committees to spend years arguing not about whether cigarettes killed, but about whether the sample size of a specific study was adequate. And while the world debated the decimals, millions continued to die. That is the terrible efficiency of this tactic. It does not need to disprove the truth. It only needs to distract you long enough for the damage to continue. Think about politics. A government is accused of systemic corruption, contracts handed to friends, public money siphoned away. The response? Not a direct defense, but a shift into minutiae. The accused official will point to one error in a journalist's report, maybe a date misquoted, maybe a figure slightly exaggerated. Suddenly, the entire conversation revolves around that one mistake. People forget the vast ocean of evidence and focus on whether the article said 10 million or 9.8 million. The house is on fire, but all eyes are on the chipped paint on the mailbox. By the time the distraction runs its course, the fire has spread, and accountability is buried under ash. We fall into this trap because the human mind loves precision. We are comforted by details because details feel controllable. It is easier to argue about the spelling of a word than to face the moral collapse of an institution. It is easier to debate the exact year of an event than to confront the horror of what that event represented. You can see this even in ordinary life. In relationships, one partner may confront the other about deep neglect or dishonesty. And instead of facing the core truth, the other replies, "That's not exactly what I said. You misremembered the wording." And suddenly, the fight is about memory accuracy, not betrayal. The betrayal slips under the rug, hidden by an avalanche of pointless precision. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon in cognitive bias. It aligns with what is called anchoring and framing. Once someone frames the argument on a detail, our brains latch onto it, often forgetting the larger picture. Think about a courtroom. A prosecutor lays out a case of theft, but the defense zooms in on whether the surveillance footage shows 7:58 p.m. or 7:59 p.m. If the jury's attention stays locked on that 1 minute, the grand question of guilt blurs away. Justice bends under the weight of irrelevance. And the terrifying part is that it doesn't even require a lie. Micro-detail distraction works because the details are often technically true. But truth in isolation can still mislead when it obscures the whole. Media, too, plays this game. A breaking scandal erupts. A corporation poisons a river. The coverage quickly fractures into arguments over data points. Exactly how many fish died, whether it was 50,000 or 52,000. Entire panels of experts debate decimal points while the larger truth, that an ecosystem was violated, that greed overrode ethics, slips out of focus. By the time the cameras move on, the audience remembers the number dispute, not the crime itself. This is not an accident. It is design. Consider another chilling example from history, the Challenger disaster in 1986. Engineers at NASA raised concerns about the O-rings that sealed the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. They warned that in cold weather, the rings could fail. But in endless meetings, the debate turned into a fixation on data presentation. How the charts were drawn, how the graphs looked, whether the vertical axis should start at 0 or not. Instead of focusing on the life or death risk, executives became entangled in the formatting of the warning. Hours were wasted on trivialities. The next morning, the shuttle exploded before millions of eyes, killing 7 astronauts. Micro-details can kill, not because they are false, but because they smother the urgency of the real. And yet, this tactic doesn't only come from leaders, institutions, or corporations. It hides in us too. How many times have you avoided a painful truth by focusing on something trivial? Instead of facing your financial troubles, you obsess over reorganizing your receipts. Instead of confronting the loneliness in your life, you get lost tweaking the settings on your phone. Instead of facing the fact that you are unhappy in your job, you spend weeks perfecting the font in your resume. We all escape into details to avoid the unbearable weight of the whole. But here lies the paradox. Details matter, up to a point. Precision is the bedrock of science, justice, and knowledge. Without attention to detail, we cannot tell truth from fiction. Yet, when detail becomes obsession, when it becomes the weapon that shields us from the core, it turns malignant. The trick is balance, to use details as tools, not as cages. To see the tree without losing the forest. To ask always, does this detail bring me closer to the truth, or does it pull me away? Micro-detail distraction is not a harmless quirk. It is one of the most effective methods of distortion humanity has ever used. It is the reason tobacco companies profited while lungs blackened, the reason politicians escape while citizens suffer, the reason tragedies unfold while meetings debate formatting. It is also the reason our own lives stall while we argue with ourselves about things that never mattered. The danger is not that details are wrong. The danger is that they are right but irrelevant. And in their irrelevance, they bury us alive. So the next time you see someone, or even yourself, zoom in too close on the cracks. Ask what wall is being hidden behind them. Because truth is not in the grain of sand. Truth is in the shoreline. And while we argue about grains, the tide is already rising. Context removal twist. Imagine a sentence torn from its home. A fragment of truth, cut loose from the soil of its full meaning. At first, it seems intact, precise, factual, unquestionable. But without its roots, without the context that gave it life, the truth becomes something else. A weapon, a distortion, a twist. This is the danger of the context removal twist, where facts remain technically correct, yet their meaning has been reshaped into something false. We live in an age where this happens constantly. A speech is clipped down to 15 seconds, stripped of the words before and after, and suddenly the meaning flips. A scientist's cautious statement, in certain controlled conditions, this effect might occur, is reduced to a bold claim, this effect occurs. A person's complex story is boiled down to one controversial line. And then, the world reacts not to reality, but to a distortion sculpted by omission. Think of how history has been twisted by this trick. Take a famous quote, "History is written by the victors." It's recited endlessly, presented as if every account of the past is propaganda. But when placed back in context, the original meaning is not quite so simple. It wasn't a universal law, but a reflection on how those in power influence narratives. Stripped of nuance, the quote becomes a weapon of cynicism, suggesting that truth itself cannot exist. A fact without context becomes a lie wearing truth's clothing. This happens in journalism every day. Imagine a headline. Doctor admits medicine kills patients. Shocking, terrifying, irresistible. But what did the doctor actually say? Perhaps it was, in extremely rare cases, when misused, this medicine can cause harm. The words are real, but the omission of their frame twists their meaning. Readers panic, outrage spreads, reputations collapse, and yet, technically, the words were never false. It is the absence of context that poisons them. Even in personal lives, we suffer from this twist. Picture a friend overhearing a single sentence of your conversation. "I don't care about them anymore." Without context, you sound cold, dismissive. But maybe the full line was, "I don't care about them anymore because I realized forgiveness matters more than resentment." One version damns you, the other redeems you. The difference is not in the words, but in the missing context that reveals their soul. Social media thrives on this distortion. Algorithms prefer fragments, short, sharp, outrage-inducing. They strip away nuance because nuance doesn't trend. A clip of anger without the reconciliation that followed. A statement of doubt without the explanation that resolved it. A complex debate reduced to a single line that makes someone look foolish, dangerous, or extreme. The truth is not erased, it's amputated. And in its mutilated form, it becomes more powerful than a lie. Context removal has always been a tool of manipulation. In ancient courts, rival factions would quote only parts of laws or religious texts to support their claims, hiding the surrounding passages that undermine them. In medieval times, heretics were condemned by selective citations of scripture, while their actual arguments were silenced. The words were real, the texts authentic, but the missing pieces twisted their meaning into daggers. Consider how even science is vulnerable. A study might find that under specific lab conditions, a chemical caused a reaction. Quoted without context, it becomes, "This chemical causes the reaction." Spread across headlines, it becomes, "This chemical is dangerous." By the time the full study is read, the twist has already rewritten public opinion. Truth, once fractured, is difficult to repair. This phenomenon also reveals something about human psychology. We crave certainty. We latch onto clear, sharp statements because they feel safe in a chaotic world. Context complicates things. It slows us down. It forces us to admit shades of gray, to sit with discomfort, to weigh possibilities instead of grabbing at absolutes. Stripping context feels easier. It gives us a clean enemy to hate, a simple fact to believe, a sharp soundbite to repeat. But in that simplicity, reality is mutilated. Ask yourself, how many judgments have you made on the basis of half-heard stories? How many people have been condemned in your mind because you only saw one sentence of their truth? How many times have you been misunderstood, quoted in fragments, your meaning inverted by omission? Context removal doesn't just distort the world, it distorts us. It divides communities, severs trust, and rewrites identities into caricatures. And perhaps the most dangerous part is this. Once a context removal twist spreads, it is almost impossible to undo. Even when the full truth is revealed, the echo of the distortion remains. A reputation once destroyed doesn't heal overnight. A lie dressed as truth lodges in memory far deeper than a correction. In that way, the twist outlives the fact. The scar remains long after the wound was exposed. The antidote, then, is vigilance. To pause before reacting. To ask, what is missing here? What was said before this? What followed after? To resist the temptation of the fragment and search for the whole. Because truth, by its very nature, is not found in isolated pieces, but in the web of connections that give them meaning. A single puzzle piece means nothing until you see the entire picture. So the next time a quote flashes across your screen, the next time outrage swells at a clipped video, the next time someone whispers half a story in your ear, remember the danger of the twist. Remember that a fact without its frame is no longer truth. It is only a shadow. And shadows, while real, are not reality. They are distortions cast by the absence of light. Semantic reframing. Imagine being in a debate where the ground keeps shifting beneath your feet. You think you are discussing one thing, but halfway through, you realize the very words you are using no longer mean what they did at the start. The person across from you hasn't provided new evidence or a stronger argument. Instead, they've quietly changed the definitions, reshaping the very foundation of the discussion. This is semantic reframing, the art, or perhaps the weapon, of twisting language so that meaning bends in the middle of a conversation, trapping you in a battle you never agreed to fight. Take a simple example. Someone argues, freedom means doing what you want. You counter that freedom also requires responsibility. But suddenly, they shift. No, freedom means the absence of government interference. The word freedom has been reframed. At first, it was about individual desire. Now it is about politics. The ground has shifted, and unless you stop to notice, you may find yourself arguing in a space you never entered. What was once a discussion about personal choice has been reframed into a debate about law, power, and governance. History is filled with this tactic. Consider the Cold War. The word patriotism was reframed in America to mean unquestioning support of the government's decisions. To question authority was painted as unpatriotic, even though true patriotism had always meant loyalty to a set of principles, not blind obedience to leaders. By changing the definition, dissenters were not only dismissed, they were cast as traitors. The reframing shifted the battleground so that critics were not debating policies, they were forced into defending their own loyalty. Language itself became a cage. This is not just political. It seeps into everyday life. In corporate culture, words like family and team are often reframed. You might hear a boss say, "We're a family here," when what they really mean is, "We expect you to sacrifice your time and boundaries without complaint." The warm, comforting frame of family is applied, but the definition has shifted. What should mean care, support, and unconditional belonging instead becomes a mask for exploitation. If you resist, it feels like betrayal, not because the argument is sound, but because the terms themselves were twisted. Even in personal relationships, reframing thrives. Picture a conversation where one partner says, "You don't love me." When pressed, they redefine love not as care or attention, but as constant agreement with their desires. Suddenly, to disagree is to prove a lack of love. The definition has been bent, and the argument is already lost, because the meaning of the word has shifted midstream. This is the silent power of semantic reframing. It doesn't win by reason. It wins by redefining the battlefield. Philosophers have long warned about this danger. If words can mean anything, then truth itself becomes slippery. George Orwell captured this in his novel 1984, where the government engaged in newspeak, deliberately narrowing and reshaping language so that rebellion became literally unthinkable. If freedom means slavery and war means peace, then arguing against the system collapses before it begins. The trick lies not in silencing opposition directly, but in reshaping the very terms so that opposition becomes self-contradiction. Psychologists note that humans crave clarity and structure, and reframing exploits this. We rarely stop mid-discussion to carefully analyze whether the same word carries the same definition it did before. Instead, we rush forward, assuming we share meaning. This assumption is the opening for manipulation. When a person reframes a word, they seize control of the conversation like a puppeteer tugging invisible strings. You may keep speaking, but the meaning of your words is no longer your own. Consider the realm of marketing. The word natural is often reframed. At first glance, it suggests something pure, healthy, untouched. But legally, the definition can be stretched to include heavily processed products, as long as they originated from something once found in nature. By the time the consumer realizes the word has shifted, they have already been persuaded. The product feels safe, trustworthy, wholesome, because the semantic frame was tilted just enough to mislead, without ever openly lying. Or take the courtroom, where lawyers are masters of reframing. A prosecutor may describe an act as violent, while the defense reframes it as self-defense. Both describe the same event, but the meaning of the word used shifts the moral weight entirely. Jurors, caught in the reframing, may find themselves swayed not by facts but by definitions. The outcome of justice hangs not on truth, but on the battle over what the words mean. This trap is especially powerful because it often goes unnoticed. Unlike circular logic, where the loop is visible if you look closely, semantic reframing hides in plain sight. It does not shout. It whispers. It changes the rules mid-game, and only when you pause to ask, wait, what do you mean by that word? Do you realize the stage has been reset beneath your feet? And by then, the argument may already be lost, because to question the definition itself is to appear evasive, pedantic, or unwilling to engage. Yet the antidote is simple, though rarely used: vigilance. The willingness to stop a discussion and demand clarity. To ask, how are you defining that term, may feel awkward, but it reclaims the ground. It prevents the word from being stolen, from becoming a weapon turned against you. True dialogue can only exist when words hold steady meaning, when both sides agree on what is being discussed. Without that, debate becomes performance, and persuasion becomes manipulation. Semantic reframing matters because language is not just a tool of communication. It is the architecture of thought. When the walls of that architecture are shifted, entire realities are restructured. Wars are justified, freedoms are stripped, relationships are poisoned, and decisions are manipulated, all through the bending of words. Words do not just describe the world, they shape it. And when someone redefines them mid-discussion, they are not merely arguing. They are rebuilding the world in their favor. So the next time you find yourself in an argument that feels strangely slippery, where the harder you push the less progress you seem to make, pause. Look at the words. Ask if they still mean what they did when you began. You may find the trap already set, the terms already altered. And in recognizing that, you may finally step outside the invisible cage, reclaiming the right not just to argue, but to think on ground that has not been stolen beneath your feet. Question reversal. Imagine asking someone a simple, direct question: did you do this? Instead of answering, they tilt their head, smile, and say, why would you even think I did that? That's question reversal. The art of answering a question with another question, a tactic designed not to clarify, but to confuse, to derail, to shift focus away from the original point. It is not merely evasive, it is manipulative. It works by planting doubt, changing direction, and subtly making the questioner feel like the one under scrutiny. Instead of light being cast on the truth, the spotlight suddenly swings back onto you. At first glance, it may seem like a harmless rhetorical trick, even a playful one. But look deeper, and you'll see how powerful it is in controlling conversations, arguments, and even entire narratives. Question reversal preys on our natural tendency to respond. When asked a question, we instinctively want to answer it. By reversing the question, the manipulator doesn't just dodge accountability. They also hijack the flow of thought, forcing you to defend yourself, explain yourself, or chase after irrelevancies, while the original issue slips quietly out of reach. Take politics, for example. A journalist asks a senator, did you accept donations from this corporation in exchange for favors? The senator smiles and responds, why are you assuming I would compromise my integrity? The accusation is never addressed. Instead, the journalist is put on the defensive, forced to explain their reasoning, their evidence, their assumptions. The burden of proof has been subtly shifted. By the time the exchange ends, the original question has evaporated, replaced by an entirely different focus. This is the sleight of hand of question reversal. It makes the accuser look like the guilty one for even daring to ask. This tactic thrives in personal relationships too. Imagine a partner asking, why didn't you call me back last night? Instead of an answer, they hear, Why do you always assume the worst about me? The question is flipped. Suddenly, the one seeking clarity is framed as the one at fault, paranoid, distrustful, overreacting. The reversal turns an inquiry into an accusation. Over time, this can become a form of psychological control, conditioning the questioner to stop asking, to stop confronting, to stop seeking truth. History offers plenty of examples as well. In famous trials, defendants and lawyers have used question reversal to sway juries. When pressed for details about incriminating evidence, they would respond not with clarity, but with counter-questions. Why would my client do something so foolish? Or do you really believe the prosecution is giving you the whole story? These questions don't prove innocence. They simply destabilize the audience's focus, planting seeds of doubt where facts should have been examined. The courtroom becomes not a place of truth, but of carefully managed misdirection. Psychologists recognize this as a tactic that exploits conversational norms. Humans are wired for reciprocity. When one person asks, the other is expected to answer. When that expectation is violated by another question, the rhythm is broken and the questioner feels off balance. Most people, caught in that sudden shift, will instinctively respond to the new question, abandoning their own. This is why question reversal is so effective. It is a conversational ambush, a judo move that uses the momentum of the question against the questioner. But the danger of question reversal is not just in everyday manipulation. It scales. In propaganda, it is a weapon. When a government is asked about human rights abuses, a common response is, "Why don't you focus on the problems in your own country?" Instead of accountability, the spotlight is redirected outward. It is a deliberate tactic to derail criticism by forcing the critic to defend themselves. Suddenly, the discussion is no longer about the government's actions, but about the critic's credibility, morality, or hypocrisy. In this way, question reversal becomes not just a personal trick, but a shield for power. You can even see this tactic embedded in philosophical debate. Socrates, the ancient master of questioning, often responded to inquiries with further questions, not to evade, but to dismantle assumptions and guide thought. Yet in the hands of manipulators, the same technique becomes corrosive. It shifts from seeking truth to obscuring it. The same blade that can sharpen the mind can also cut the thread of reason when wielded with the wrong intent. Consider debates you've seen online. Someone asks, "Do you have evidence for that claim?" The response, "Why do you need evidence when the truth is obvious?" Or worse, "Why are you so afraid of questioning the mainstream narrative?" The demand for evidence disappears, buried under a counter-question that reframes the asker as closed-minded. The real subject, the truth of the claim, vanishes into smoke. The insidious power of question reversal lies in its ability to turn defense into offense. It weaponizes curiosity. It hijacks the natural rules of dialogue and flips them upside down. And unless the questioner has the presence of mind to refuse the reversal and bring the focus back, the tactic succeeds. The truth remains unanswered, and the manipulator walks away unscathed. So the next time someone answers your question with a question, pause. Ask yourself, is this curiosity or is this evasion? Are they guiding me toward clarity or away from it? Because not every question deserves an answer. Sometimes, the real answer is hidden in the silence that follows the question they refuse to face. False equivalence fog. Imagine this. Two issues are laid side by side, as if they were equals. One is a systemic injustice destroying lives. The other is a minor inconvenience, a trivial irritation. And yet, through the language of comparison, they are made to appear the same. This is the fog of false equivalence, when unlike things are equated to blur truth, to distort morality, and to paralyze judgment. It is not about lies in the traditional sense. It is about dilution. It is about taking the sharp edge of outrage and filing it down until nothing cuts anymore. Think of a political scandal where billions of dollars are stolen from public funds. Instead of addressing the theft, the defenders say, well, ordinary people also cheat on their taxes. One is grand theft, a deliberate draining of entire nations. The other might be a middle-class worker exaggerating a deduction. Both are wrong, but they are not equal. By comparing them, the thief stands in the fog of blurred judgment, hoping you will forget scale, forget magnitude, forget harm. False equivalence thrives not in the details, but in the erosion of proportion. History is thick with this manipulation. During the civil rights movement in America, activists demanding equality were often accused of being just as extreme as the segregationists. On one side were citizens fighting for dignity, voting rights, and survival. On the other were systems designed to enforce inequality and terror. To place them on equal ground was not balance, it was distortion. But to the casual listener, it created confusion. It suggested that justice and oppression were two sides of the same coin, as if morality had no hierarchy, as if every action, no matter how righteous or cruel, weighed the same on the scales of history. False equivalence also infects the way we talk about violence. Consider how often protest movements are condemned because both sides resorted to aggression. A shattered window is placed on the same level as a shattered skull. Property damage and human life are treated as equal offenses. The moral clarity evaporates in the fog. By flattening everything into sameness, power escapes accountability, and the suffering of the vulnerable is minimized. The tactic works because our minds are drawn to symmetry. We like the illusion of fairness. But fairness twisted into false symmetry becomes a weapon against truth itself. You can see this in debates about climate change. Oil companies faced with accusations of poisoning the atmosphere sometimes counter with, "Well, you drive a car too, don't you?" The implication is that the individual and the multinational corporation are equally guilty. But the scales are absurdly tilted. A single person driving to work is not equivalent to industries pumping billions of tons of carbon into the sky. Yet, if framed well enough, the argument can convince audiences that responsibility is shared equally, and therefore, no one should be held accountable. This is how the fog spreads, not by denying facts, but by obscuring proportions. False equivalence is also personal. In relationships, one person might betray trust, lying, cheating, breaking bonds. When confronted, they might respond with, "Well, you forgot my birthday." A deep wound is compared to a shallow cut. By placing them side by side, guilt is redistributed, balance is faked, and clarity is lost. The injured person begins to question themselves, as if the betrayal and the oversight carried the same weight. That is the cruelty of this fog. It does not only protect the guilty, it confuses the innocent. In psychology, this tactic aligns with cognitive distortions known as moral balancing and whataboutism. When someone is cornered by the truth, they attempt to level the field by dragging unrelated issues into the frame. The Soviet Union once responded to criticisms of its gulags by pointing to racism in America. Critics of apartheid pointed to crime in black communities. Each response was not a defense, but a diversion, a way to claim that since no one is pure, no one can judge. It is the logic of stalemate, where accountability disappears because perfection is unattainable. The danger of false equivalence is that it erodes our moral compass. If everything is the same, then nothing is truly wrong. If every harm is equal, then every atrocity is forgivable. When a dictatorship equates its oppression with the discipline of a family, when a war crime is compared to the misstep of a soldier, when a genocide is weighed against the inconveniences of its victims, truth itself collapses. The fog becomes so thick that you can no longer see who is burning the forest and who is planting trees. And yet, this fog survives because it feels fair. It flatters our desire for balance, for both sides. But the world is not symmetrical. A mosquito bite and a bullet wound are not the same because both draw blood. A broken promise and a broken nation are not the same because both cause disappointment. To allow such comparisons is to surrender the ability to judge, to discern, to stand for truth. False equivalence is one of the subtlest weapons of distortion. It does not scream. It whispers. It does not deny the existence of harm. It relabels it until harm and healing, cruelty and justice, truth and lies all stand in the same line. And in that blur, the guilty survive. The powerful endure. The world forgets how to tell night from day. So the next time you hear someone say, "But what about?" pause. Ask yourself, are these things truly equal? Or is someone pulling the curtain of fog across your eyes? Because clarity is not in comparing everything. Clarity is in remembering that not all wrongs weigh the same, not all crimes stand equal, and not every truth can be buried in the same shallow grave. Premature conclusion push. Picture this. A trial is still unfolding. Witnesses haven't all spoken. Evidence hasn't been fully examined, yet the jury has already whispered its verdict in their minds. This is the essence of the premature conclusion push, rushing to judgment before the full picture is even in view. It's the intellectual equivalent of stopping a movie halfway through and declaring you know the ending. And while it feels efficient, decisive, even powerful, it is one of the most dangerous traps in human reasoning. Because the moment we leap to a conclusion without the complete set of facts, we sacrifice truth for speed and clarity for illusion. Why do we do this? Human minds crave closure. Uncertainty gnaws at us, so we fill the gaps with assumptions, guesses, or fragments of familiar patterns. If we hear one detail, we quickly build an entire story around it. A person coughs twice on the train. We whisper they must be sick. A stranger avoids eye contact. We decide they're guilty of something. The brain, desperate to resolve ambiguity, stitches together incomplete data into a seemingly solid narrative. But like a rushed painting, the brushstrokes may form an image that isn't real. History is riddled with tragedies born from premature conclusions. During the infamous Salem witch trials, rumors and half-seen behaviors were taken as proof of consorting with the devil. Women were executed not because of evidence, but because fear demanded quick answers. Centuries later, wars have been waged on the basis of incomplete intelligence, missile programs, hidden stockpiles, phantom threats, narratives formed before the facts were secured, leaving nations scarred. Each time, the rush to judgment carried consequences too heavy to erase. On a smaller scale, think of medicine. A doctor sees a few common symptoms and, without waiting for tests, declares a diagnosis. Confidence replaces patience. But what if the condition is rare? What if the missing test results reveal the opposite? For the patient, that rush could be fatal. Or in personal relationships, someone doesn't reply to a message, and instantly the mind concludes they don't care. Hours later, the truth emerges. Their phone died, or they were caught in a storm. But by then, the damage may already be done. Anger brewed, trust weakened, all because of a story written too soon. The premature conclusion push isn't just about impatience. It's also a weapon. In debates, adversaries seize on the first fragment of information and hammer it as final proof, drowning out any later nuance. In media, headlines deliver judgments before investigations finish, shaping public opinion in ways that no correction can ever undo. It's faster to brand someone guilty in a headline than to carefully walk readers through uncertainty. And in a world where attention spans are shrinking, quick conclusions are not just common, they're expected. But the price is truth. When we leap too quickly, we lock ourselves into a position that resists correction. Psychologists call this belief perseverance. Once we've formed a judgment, even overwhelming contradictory evidence struggles to shake it. The first conclusion becomes the anchor, and everything else is filtered to defend it. That's why conspiracy theories thrive, why false accusations destroy lives, why rumors spread like wildfire. The premature conclusion is not just a mistake, it is a self-reinforcing cage. And yet, there's something seductive about it. Making fast judgments feels like strength. It gives us the illusion of control, as though by deciding quickly we've mastered uncertainty. But the truth is the opposite. Rushing blinds us. It makes us puppets of fear, ego, and bias. The wise know that patience is not weakness, it is protection. Delaying the conclusion until the evidence is whole may feel uncomfortable, but it is the only path to clarity. So how do we resist? By remembering that the story isn't finished until it's finished. By cultivating the humility to say, I don't know yet. Those 3 words are harder to speak than any premature judgment, but they carry more power. Because they leave room for growth, for correction, for truth to emerge unclouded. In the end, the premature conclusion push is a lesson in restraint. The world tempts us to decide instantly, to leap ahead of the facts, to claim certainty where only fragments exist. But if we pause, if we breathe, if we let time reveal what it hides, we find that truth has its own rhythm. Rushing only distorts it. Waiting allows it to speak. And those who listen patiently are the ones who see reality as it truly is, not as their fear or haste imagines it to be. Historical parallel overreach. Imagine this. Someone faces a modern inconvenience, a new policy, a controversial leader, a cultural shift, and instead of analyzing it on its own terms, they reach for history's most dramatic chapters. Suddenly, a routine disagreement becomes the next French Revolution. A political rival becomes another Hitler. A minor debate about regulations is likened to the fall of Rome. This is the phenomenon of historical parallel overreach, where exaggerated comparisons to history don't enlighten, they distort. At first, it seems harmless. After all, humans learn through analogy. History provides us with patterns, lessons, warnings. To say this moment feels like that one is natural. But when the parallels are stretched too far, when the comparison serves more to provoke than to explain, meaning collapses. The weight of history is misused as a hammer, smashing nuance into dust. Consider the way political discourse often unfolds. Opponents are rarely just opponents. They are cast as tyrants waiting to rise. Every leader is compared to Caesar crossing the Rubicon, every policy to Weimar Germany's collapse, every protest to the storming of the Bastille. The danger of such comparisons is not just exaggeration, it's distortion. The unique complexities of today are buried beneath borrowed drama from the past. What could have been sober analysis turns into historical theater. Take, for example, how often Hitler is invoked. A leader increases government power. It's Nazi Germany all over again. A controversial law is passed. This is the beginning of fascism. But real history is not so cheaply transplanted. Hitler's rise was shaped by World War I's devastation, economic collapse, mass resentment, and propaganda machinery of unprecedented scale. To slap that comparison onto any disliked figure is to cheapen the horror of the past and to obscure the realities of the present. The lesson of history is lost because the comparison has been stretched beyond recognition. Or think about Rome, the favorite metaphor for decline. A modern empire faces debt, corruption, inequality, and instantly, commentators proclaim, this is the fall of Rome. But Rome's collapse spanned centuries, shaped by barbarian invasions, shifting trade networks, religious transformation, and internal decay. To use it as a one-size-fits-all analogy for any modern struggle is not insight, it's laziness. It feeds fear without offering clarity. It replaces analysis with spectacle. This kind of overreach thrives because it is emotionally powerful. History is filled with dramatic symbols, tanks rolling into cities, heads falling beneath guillotines, empires crumbling into dust. To invoke those symbols in the present stirs emotions, fear, anger, urgency. It simplifies a complex debate into an epic battle of good versus evil. But reality rarely mirrors history so neatly. When we exaggerate the parallels, we blind ourselves to the differences that matter most. The consequences can be profound. In public discourse, historical overreach polarizes. If your opponent is literally Hitler, how could compromise ever be moral? If today's policy is the fall of Rome, then every debate is an existential crisis. Dialogue collapses, replaced by alarmism. In this way, overreaching historical comparisons don't just distort reality. They actively poison it, making reasoned conversation impossible. In personal life, too, we fall into this trap. A bad relationship is likened to living in a dictatorship. A workplace disagreement becomes a witch hunt. By stretching history into personal metaphor, we inflate our struggles, dramatizing them beyond recognition. The result is not empowerment but distortion, where the truth of our situation is lost beneath the performance of historical tragedy. Psychology explains why this happens. Our minds love stories, and history offers the richest archive of them. To compare a rival to a dictator feels satisfying because it places us into a familiar narrative. The hero versus the tyrant, freedom versus oppression, collapse versus resilience. But the satisfaction of the story often replaces the accuracy of analysis. We grab at history not to understand, but to dramatize. And in doing so, we twist both the past and the present. There are, of course, valid parallels in history. Patterns do repeat. Lessons are worth drawing. But the line between insight and overreach is delicate. Insight requires humility, acknowledging similarities while honoring differences. Overreach demands exaggeration, collapsing complexities into cliches. And when exaggeration becomes the norm, history ceases to be a guide. It becomes a prop in a theater of fear. Ask yourself, how many times have you heard someone declare, "This is just like," and felt the gravity of the past pressing down, only to realize the comparison was paper-thin? How many arguments have been won not by facts, but by invoking the ghosts of history to frighten people into agreement? How many times has a debate spiraled into hysteria because someone raised the specter of Rome, Hitler, or the Inquisition, as if today's issues were carbon copies of ancient horrors? The truth is, history deserves better. Its lessons are too precious to be cheapened by overreach. The French Revolution was not a meme to be pasted onto any protest. The collapse of Rome was not a metaphor for your national debt. Hitler was not every leader you dislike. When we overuse these parallels, we drain them of meaning. We strip them of their horror, their lessons, their truth. We make history hollow. The antidote is restraint. To use history carefully, acknowledging its echoes without forcing them. To honor the past by refusing to turn it into caricature. To face the present not as a reenactment, but as something unique, demanding its own analysis. When we resist the temptation of dramatic parallels, we allow history to do what it does best, guide us with humility, rather than intoxicate us with exaggeration. So the next time someone reaches for the fall of Rome to explain a political debate, or the next time an opponent is cast as the next dictator, pause. Ask, does the comparison truly fit, or is it just theater? Is this history teaching us, or is it history being abused to frighten us? For the truth is simple. When parallels are stretched too far, they don't clarify the present, they corrupt it. And in that corruption, we lose not only understanding of our own time, but the very lessons history tried to leave behind. Overconnecting dots. Picture someone staring at a night sky, connecting stars into constellations. A few points of light, scattered and unconnected, become heroes, beasts, and myths. The human mind is wired to see patterns, even where none exist. But sometimes that instinct goes too far, and imagination turns into a trap. Overconnecting dots is the tendency to draw elaborate lines between unrelated things, to weave stories from coincidence, until reality itself becomes a tangled web of illusions that feels more real than truth. Think of the classic detective story where every clue seems meaningful. The broken clock, the stray footprint, the half-burnt letter. In fiction, those details align neatly into a grand revelation. But life is not fiction. A broken clock might just be broken. A footprint might belong to a passerby. The half-burnt paper might be trash. Yet when our minds hunger for explanation, we stretch threads until they tie everything together. The result feels profound, but it may be nothing more than coincidence framed as inevitability. Consider conspiracy theories. A politician sneezes in public, the stock market dips that afternoon, and somewhere, a theory emerges linking the two events into a shadowy plot. The mind craves meaning, so randomness is not enough. It becomes a plan, a scheme, a hidden signal. A plane flies overhead, and a rumor spreads of chemical trails. A celebrity posts a vague symbol online, and suddenly entire forums erupt with speculation about secret societies. None of it is provable, but the connections themselves feel addictive, as if discovering a hidden order. The satisfaction lies not in truth, but in the illusion that everything connects. Overconnecting dots thrives in uncertainty. When something frightening or mysterious happens, the brain demands order. Think of ancient societies watching the skies. Eclipses became omens. Comets became prophecies. A harvest failure was blamed on the anger of gods. In reality, the eclipse was orbital mechanics, the comet a wandering rock, the famine a result of weather. But without understanding, humans filled the gaps with stories, stitching the dots into a grand pattern that seemed to explain everything. The same impulse lives in us today. We see faces in clouds, intent in accidents, patterns in noise. Psychologists call this apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. It's why gamblers believe a slot machine is due for a win after a string of losses. It's why someone insists their lucky shirt affects the outcome of a sports match. The dots don't truly connect, but the story they create feels unshakable. Our brains reward us with dopamine when we detect a pattern, whether it's real or not. The thrill of discovery blinds us to the possibility that nothing was there to begin with. But overconnecting dots isn't just harmless superstition. It can be dangerous. Imagine a courtroom where a jury strings together unrelated details. The defendant looked nervous. They live near the crime scene. They own a jacket similar to the suspects. None of these prove guilt, but stitched together, they form a damning narrative. A life can be destroyed by an illusion of connections that do not exist. In politics, leaders have exploited this tendency to unite people against imagined enemies, drawing lines between unrelated events to create a story of conspiracy and threat. Entire wars have been fueled by overconnected dots. Even in personal life, the trap looms. A friend doesn't return a call. You remember something strange they said last week. You notice a vague post on social media, and suddenly you've convinced yourself they're hiding betrayal. 3 unrelated dots spiral into a theory that poisons trust. Lovers destroy relationships not because of what happened, but because of the elaborate web of imagined links they spun between harmless events. The trap is subtle but devastating. It convinces you that your story must be real, simply because the connections feel undeniable. The most haunting part is that sometimes, overconnecting dots feels indistinguishable from genius. Many breakthroughs in science began with unlikely connections. Newton linking an apple's fall to the motion of the moon, Darwin connecting finches' beaks to evolution. The line between madness and insight is razor thin. What separates them is evidence. Without it, connections are only stories, endlessly branching webs where every new thread strengthens the illusion but not the truth. The danger is mistaking the beauty of a pattern for the reality of proof. To see this clearly, imagine walking through a forest and finding shapes in tree bark. You see faces, symbols, hidden messages. The more you look, the more you find. But the trees are not speaking. They are only trees. The messages exist only in your mind. Overconnecting dots is like this, a world filled with imagined whispers, where silence is never just silence, and coincidence is never just chance. It traps you in a narrative of your own creation, a labyrinth with no exit, because every new detail, no matter how random, is woven into the story. Breaking free requires discipline, the willingness to ask, is this connection real, or is it only in my head? It means demanding evidence strong enough to hold weight on its own, rather than propping it up with endless threads. It means resisting the seduction of certainty that patterns bring. True wisdom lies not in seeing connections everywhere, but in knowing which connections matter and which are illusions. The truth is, not every dot needs to connect. Some stars are just stars. Some events are just noise. Some coincidences mean nothing. To force them into elaborate webs is to trap yourself in stories that explain everything while revealing nothing. Overconnecting dots is not the discovery of hidden order. It is the creation of cages woven from threads of imagination. And unless you recognize it, you may mistake the prison of your own patterns for the map of reality itself. Volume over clarity. Imagine a voice that never stops. Words pour out endlessly, not in the service of clarity, but to overwhelm, to bury, to exhaust. This is the tactic of volume over clarity, speaking or writing so much that the essential message becomes unrecognizable. It's a strategy as old as rhetoric itself. If the truth is dangerous, drown it in verbiage. If the answer is simple but inconvenient, cloak it in 10,000 words. At first it feels like abundance, generosity of information, but look closely. It is concealment masquerading as explanation. Picture a courtroom where a lawyer, instead of addressing the single damning piece of evidence, launches into a 3-hour monologue filled with case law, irrelevant precedents, Latin phrases, and technical jargon. By the end, the jury doesn't remember the incriminating detail. They remember only the fog. In politics, the same thing happens. A reporter asks a direct question. Did you approve this policy? The politician answers with 20 minutes of economic statistics, historical anecdotes, and emotional appeals about what really matters to the people. The original point vanishes, not because it was answered, but because it was buried alive under the avalanche of words. Psychologists call this cognitive overload. Our minds are not infinite processors. When given too much, we shut down. Instead of analyzing, we surrender. We cling to fragments that sound familiar or comforting. And those who exploit volume over clarity know this. They don't need to lie. They just need to speak more than you can follow. In the flood of sound, the sharp edges of truth are dulled. Consider propaganda in the 20th century. Totalitarian regimes often relied on endless speeches, daily broadcasts, newspapers filled with page after page of ideological slogans. The repetition and sheer volume of information created the illusion of substance. People were too tired to question, too overwhelmed to notice contradictions. The simple truths, shortages, suffering, corruption, were drowned in the roar of grand speeches about progress, destiny, and national pride. By the time silence came, minds were already saturated, unable to pick apart what had actually been said. You've probably experienced this in everyday life. Think of the colleague who answers a simple email with a 5-page essay, layering every possible angle until you forget what you even asked. Or the student who, unprepared for an exam question, fills the page with unrelated facts, hoping the sheer weight of words will mask the lack of an answer. Or the partner in an argument who refuses to stop talking, stringing together grievance after grievance until the original issue disappears in the fog of volume. In each case, clarity is the casualty. There is also a darker dimension. Volume over clarity is a form of dominance. The one who controls the most airtime controls the frame of reality. When someone speaks endlessly, without pause, they are not just avoiding the point. They are denying you the space to think, to question, to breathe. In this sense, the tactic is not just rhetorical. It is psychological warfare. The torrent of words becomes a weapon, forcing submission not by logic, but by fatigue. Look at corporate scandals. When companies are caught in wrongdoing, their official statements are often labyrinths of language, operational misalignments, unexpected challenges, non-optimal outcomes. Simple phrases like "we failed" or "we lied" are never spoken. Instead, paragraphs upon paragraphs smother the truth. Investors and the public are left exhausted, half convinced there was never a single point to begin with. This is no accident. It is volume carefully designed to obscure clarity. Even in our digital world, the tactic thrives. Think of terms of service agreements, dozens of pages of dense, unreadable legal text. Inside those walls of words, key clauses are buried. The rights you surrender, the surveillance you agree to, the data you give away. Nobody reads them. That's the point. The volume is the camouflage. The clarity would be too shocking if stated plainly. "We can sell your data" is unacceptable. But hidden on page 37, line 218, it slips past unnoticed. The brilliance and the horror of this tactic is that it feels like abundance. More words, more data, more explanation. Yet the excess is poison. In ancient times, philosophers warned that truth is simple, but deception is elaborate. The moment you feel buried in explanations, the moment you sense the fog thickening, ask yourself, what single point is being hidden beneath this storm of words? Because somewhere, beneath the noise, there is always a core truth. And it is precisely that truth the speaker does not want you to see. Volume over clarity is not simply careless communication. It is deliberate suffocation. It is the art of flooding the air until silence, the silence where truth might have stood, is impossible. And the danger is this. When people grow accustomed to fog, they forget what clear air feels like. They stop searching for clarity and instead accept the noise as reality itself. So the next time you hear endless words pouring forth, ask yourself not, what am I being told, but what is being hidden by the telling? In the end, clarity is not buried by accident. It is buried because someone wanted it gone. And the only way to reclaim it is to stop listening to the flood and start searching for the single stone of truth at the bottom. Authority cloaking. Picture this. A debate begins, not with evidence, not with logic, not with lived reality, but with a name, a credential, a title. Dr. So-and-so says, the professor once wrote, the famous leader declared. And from that point forward, the entire argument hides beneath the borrowed weight of someone else's authority. This is authority cloaking, the art of masking weak reasoning under the shadow of powerful names. It thrives on our instinct to trust experts, to defer to hierarchy, to surrender our doubt in the presence of credentials. And yet, beneath the polished surface, the core argument is often hollow. At its heart, authority cloaking is not about truth, it is about impression. When a politician cannot defend their policy with evidence, they summon think tanks, former officials, or cherry-picked experts to speak for them. When a corporation faces backlash, they line up consultants and academics, quoting selectively to drown the public in a wall of professional validation. It feels convincing because it carries the aura of expertise. But expertise, when detached from substance, becomes camouflage. The illusion works because humans are wired to equate authority with certainty. And in that reflex, dangerous reasoning finds shelter. History provides chilling examples. In the 20th century, tobacco companies did not argue directly that smoking was safe. Instead, they endlessly quoted doctors, paid doctors, carefully selected, rehearsed voices, who reassured the public that cigarettes were harmless, even healthy. Ads featured physicians in white coats endorsing brands, turning a product that destroyed lungs into a product cloaked in the aura of medicine. The truth was buried not by facts, but by the repetition of authority. Millions trusted the image of the expert, and millions suffered for it. This tactic thrives in politics. A leader might propose a policy with no grounding in reality, but defend it by saying, "Respected economists agree." Which economists? Which studies? Often, none are named. Or if they are handpicked from the margins, chosen precisely because they validate the claim. The power of authority cloaking is not in the argument itself, but in the way it short-circuits critical thought. It whispers to the listener, "Who are you to question the experts?" And in that hesitation, the weak argument slips by unchallenged. Even in science, where authority should matter, the tactic can mislead. Consider how climate denialists for years paraded a handful of contrarian scientists, quoting them endlessly, as if their minority view erased the overwhelming consensus of thousands. The authority of a few was inflated to mask the weakness of the position. It created a false image of balance, convincing many that the science was still debated, when in reality, the debate had long been settled. The names mattered more than the numbers, and the cloak worked exactly as intended. You can see authority cloaking in everyday life as well. In personal arguments, someone might say, "Well, my uncle is a lawyer, and he says I'm right." Or, "A doctor once told me this diet works." Instead of making a case, they borrow the authority of someone else. Sometimes the authority figure isn't even credible within the field in question, but their title alone is enough to silence doubt. The actual reasoning is left weak, unsupported, but hidden beneath the gleam of borrowed power. Psychologists link this to a cognitive bias known as appeal to authority. Our brains are trained from childhood to respect teachers, parents, leaders. Authority feels safe. But cloaking exploits that reflex, pushing us to accept claims without testing them. It replaces critical thought with obedience. It creates a chain of borrowed certainty. I don't need to prove this, because someone important already has. And if you question it, you are painted as disrespectful, unqualified, or even dangerous. The darker side of this tactic is seen in authoritarian regimes. Dictators and strongmen rarely argue their policies through evidence. Instead, they cloak themselves in the authority of tradition, religion, or historical figures. They quote revered leaders from the past, invoke sacred texts, or parade loyal scholars who echo their words. The reasoning does not matter. The authority becomes the shield. Dissenters are told they are not just opposing a man, but an entire lineage of authority. In this fog, weak arguments transform into unquestionable truths. And yet, authority in itself is not the enemy. True expertise is invaluable. A surgeon's advice should weigh more than a stranger's guess. A climate scientist's analysis should matter more than a random opinion. The problem begins when authority replaces reasoning, when the cloak is used not to enlighten, but to obscure. The danger is not in listening to experts, but in letting their names silence our questions. Authority cloaking endures because it feels safe. It reassures us that the world is orderly, that the powerful know what they're doing, that someone else has already done the hard thinking. But safety without truth is only illusion. And when illusion becomes habit, we stop asking the questions that keep power accountable. So the next time you hear a claim wrapped in credentials, pause. Ask, where's the reasoning? Where's the evidence? Does the authority clarify, or does it conceal? Because truth does not fear questions, and real expertise does not hide behind repetition of names. But weak reasoning always does. The cloak is not there to reveal truth. It is there to distract you from noticing its absence. Mirror accusation. Imagine standing in a room where every accusation hurled at you feels strangely familiar, because it is the very weapon being used against you. This is the phenomenon of mirror accusation, the tactic of accusing others of the exact crime, flaw, or manipulation you are guilty of yourself. It is not merely hypocrisy. It is a deliberate inversion, a weaponized reflection, turning the spotlight away from the accuser and onto their target. At first, it seems almost absurd. If someone is lying, why would they accuse others of dishonesty? If someone is manipulating, why would they shout manipulation louder than anyone else? But this tactic works precisely because it disorients. It scrambles the signal. It forces the audience into confusion, unsure who is the true offender. And in that fog, the guilty slip away, hiding behind the chaos they themselves created. Consider politics. A leader accused of corruption points the finger first. No, it is my enemies who are corrupt. They are the liars. They are the ones twisting truth. Suddenly, the charge is mirrored back. The debate collapses not into evidence, but into symmetrical accusation. Both sides point at each other. Both claim the moral high ground, and the public, unable to tell which reflection is real, gives up on truth altogether. The tactic doesn't have to prove innocence. It only has to create enough doubt to make guilt indistinguishable. History is filled with such examples. During the Cold War, propaganda machines on both sides accused the other of brainwashing, while simultaneously saturating their own populations with state narratives. The accusation mirrored the tactic. Each side claimed the other was guilty of manipulation, even as they both engaged in it. And so, the world lived in mirrors, everyone pointing fingers, no one holding the weight of truth. On a personal level, this tactic shows up in toxic relationships. A partner who constantly gaslights might accuse you of gaslighting. A friend who betrays trust might angrily accuse you of disloyalty. The twist cuts deep because it destabilizes your sense of reality. You begin to question yourself. Am I the one at fault? Or are they projecting onto me? This is the essence of mirror accusation, to weaponize reflection so the target loses their footing. Psychologists recognize this as a common defense mechanism. Projection is one form, taking the qualities we dislike in ourselves and accusing others of them. But mirror accusation goes further. It is not unconscious deflection, it is active strategy. It works because accusations themselves are powerful, regardless of their truth. Once spoken, they leave a stain. And when both sides are stained, the difference between guilt and innocence feels blurred. Think about debates online. Someone spreads misinformation. When called out, they don't defend. They accuse their critics of being the real spreaders of misinformation. The cycle feeds itself. Soon, the audience doesn't know who to believe. Both sides appear guilty, and in that stalemate, the original manipulator achieves their goal, escape through confusion. The brilliance and the horror of this tactic is that it uses truth itself as camouflage. The guilty act is real, but by reflecting it outward, the accuser creates a hall of mirrors. Everyone sees the same flaw, but no one knows where it truly began. Imagine a thief shouting "thief" in a crowded square. Who will the crowd believe? The one shouting the loudest, or the silent one caught in disbelief? In many cases, the false accuser wins, not because they are innocent, but because they struck first. Mirror accusation also thrives in group conflicts. Entire nations, religions, or ideologies accuse each other of the same sins: intolerance, oppression, violence. Both sides are often guilty, but the mirror effect allows each to justify their actions. We are not violent, they are violent. We are not suppressing them, they are suppressing us. The symmetry of accusation creates endless cycles of retaliation. The reflection becomes indistinguishable from the original crime. Ask yourself, how many times have you heard two people argue, each accusing the other of the exact same thing? How many times have you watched debates where both sides shout "fake news," leaving the audience paralyzed, unsure who is right? How many times have you been accused of a flaw that, deep down, you knew belonged not to you, but to the one pointing the finger? The deeper danger of mirror accusation is not just that it hides guilt. It erodes trust itself. If everyone is accused of dishonesty, who can be believed? If everyone is accused of manipulation, who can be trusted? The tactic poisons the very concept of truth. It is not designed to win arguments. It is designed to destroy the playing field of truth altogether. And yet, there is a paradox here. Mirror accusation reveals guilt, even as it hides it. When someone accuses others of the very tactic they are using, they unconsciously confess. Their weapon of reflection is also a mirror turned inward. If we pay attention, if we refuse to be blinded by symmetry, we can sometimes see through the trick. The louder someone screams, "Liar," the more closely we should examine their own words. But vigilance is difficult. In a world flooded with mirrors, it becomes easier to give up, to assume that everyone is guilty, that no truth exists. This is the ultimate victory of the mirror accuser. When no one is trusted, the manipulator thrives in the shadows, protected by the chaos they themselves created. The antidote is patience. To slow down, to sift through evidence, to resist the immediate emotional pull of accusation. To notice patterns, who consistently mirrors, who always deflects, who never accepts responsibility. The truth is there, but it requires piercing through the reflection, refusing to accept the mirror as reality. So the next time you hear someone loudly accusing others of the very tactics they employ, pause. Ask yourself, is this truth, or is it reflection? Is this accusation rooted in reality, or is it a mirror designed to blind? For mirrors may reflect reality, but they do not replace it. And when accusations echo endlessly between them, only the patient eye can see through to what is real. Rulebook weaponization. Imagine walking into a room with confidence, ready to defend your point, only to be buried beneath a mountain of obscure clauses, footnotes, and legal jargon that no ordinary person could possibly memorize. This is rulebook weaponization, the practice of taking the very systems meant to ensure fairness and using them as weapons to silence, intimidate, or mislead. It's not about clarity or justice. It's about power disguised as procedure, about controlling the game by overwhelming you with rules until you forget what you came to say. At first glance, rules seem like protection. They promise order, structure, and fairness. But in the wrong hands, they become a trap. Imagine a courtroom where a lawyer, instead of focusing on truth, drowns the jury in obscure precedents and technicalities. Imagine a workplace where a manager cites page after page of policy not to solve a problem, but to break the spirit of anyone daring to challenge them. Rulebook weaponization is not the pursuit of justice. It is the deliberate twisting of order into chaos, where complexity itself becomes the cage. History gives us chilling examples. Totalitarian regimes have often cloaked themselves in endless regulations, requiring citizens to comply with laws so dense and contradictory that breaking them became inevitable. In Stalinist Russia, for example, people were arrested not because they violated morality or harmed others, but because the sprawling codes of conduct made everyone guilty of something. The law wasn't there to protect, it was there to terrify. Rulebook weaponization created a society where survival meant silence, where the fear of hidden infractions controlled every step. You see it in modern times too. Bureaucracy often becomes a shield for corruption. A citizen asks for a simple service, and instead of a straightforward answer, they are met with forms, stamps, cross-references, and obscure conditions. By the time the process is over, exhaustion has replaced resolve. The powerful know this. They know that burying truth beneath layers of procedure keeps most people from digging. And so the rulebook, once meant to level the playing field, becomes a wall to keep outsiders away. Even in smaller, everyday settings, the same tactic appears. A student challenges a teacher's unfair grading, only to be bombarded with references to obscure rules buried in the academic handbook. A tenant questions a landlord's illegal demand, but instead of reason, they're handed photocopied lines from outdated contracts, twisted just enough to intimidate. In these moments, the person holding the rules isn't upholding justice. They're wielding them like a blade. The psychological effect is devastating. When someone weaponizes the rulebook against you, they're not trying to convince you with reason. They're trying to exhaust you into surrender. They create a battlefield where knowledge is no longer power, but a maze of deliberate confusion. If you're not trained in that system, you feel small, powerless, crushed by the illusion of authority. That's the brilliance of this tactic. It doesn't have to be right to win. It only has to overwhelm. And here lies the danger. When people believe rules are too complex to challenge, they stop questioning them altogether. The result is compliance through fear, obedience without understanding. Those who wield the rulebook as a weapon rely on this silence. They don't need the rule to be correct. They just need it to sound official, to look intimidating, to drain your energy before you even realize the foundation was hollow. But the truth is that simplicity often dismantles this weapon. When stripped of jargon, many of these rules reveal their fragility. Some don't even apply. Some contradict themselves. Some are relics, never meant for the situation at hand. Yet, the weaponized version thrives on your unwillingness to look closer. It feeds on fatigue. The antidote, then, is clarity, asking, what does this rule actually say? Does it even apply here? And who benefits from this complexity? These questions pierce through the fog. In the end, rulebook weaponization is not just about obscure laws or corporate policies. It's about power. It thrives where people accept intimidation as authority, where complexity replaces truth. To resist it, you don't need to memorize every clause. You need to remember that rules, at their core, were written to serve people, not to enslave them. So the next time someone buries you under an avalanche of obscure regulations, recognize the tactic for what it is. It's not intelligence, it's not order, it's a shield of intimidation. And when you strip away the layers, when you stand calmly against the flood of words, you'll see the truth, that the rulebook is only as powerful as the fear it creates. Break the fear, and you break the weapon. Overclassification layer. Imagine walking into a simple room, only to find that every object has been labeled, sorted, and subdivided into endless categories. The chair is not just a chair. It is classified as wooden, domestic, lightweight, single-seated, possibly antique. The lamp is not just a lamp. It is tagged by color, by height, by shade material, by bulb type, by symbolic meaning. Soon the room is no longer a place to rest, but a maze of categories, a jungle of labels. This is the trap of the overclassification layer, when unnecessary divisions and invented categories pile up until the original issue is buried beneath an illusion of complexity. It begins with good intentions. Classification is supposed to bring clarity. Scientists sort species, historians divide eras, doctors categorize diseases. But there is a point where categorization stops illuminating and starts suffocating. Think of a workplace drowning in bureaucracy, where forms must be filed in triplicate, each stamped under a subdepartment, each reviewed by a committee. The work itself gets lost. The structure grows more important than the purpose. Complexity disguises itself as sophistication, and people confuse endless categories with deeper understanding. Consider psychology. There are countless ways to classify human personality. Introvert versus extrovert, type A versus type B, dozens of modern typologies that reduce people into letters or numbers. Each system claims to explain who we are. But as new categories are invented, the classifications multiply. Soon we're not just introverts. We're subtypes of subtypes, hybrids of hybrids. The individual disappears under the weight of labels. Instead of clarity, there is confusion. Instead of self-understanding, there is the illusion that identity can be dissected into an endless taxonomy. In politics, the overclassification layer becomes a weapon. Instead of addressing an issue directly, say, poverty, it is carved into layers of invented categories: urban poverty, rural poverty, generational poverty, situational poverty, hidden poverty, cultural poverty. The issue becomes so fragmented that solutions vanish in the fog of labels. Complexity masks inaction. By endlessly subdividing, leaders appear knowledgeable, but they avoid the simple truth. People are suffering, and they need help. The layering creates the illusion of expertise while preventing progress. Even in ordinary conversation, overclassification lurks. Someone may argue not against your idea itself, but against the way it is categorized. They might say, "That's not really freedom, it's autonomy," or "That's not courage, it's resilience." The debate shifts away from meaning into semantics, from substance into categories. Suddenly, nothing can be discussed without first mapping a forest of invented distinctions. The argument grows heavy with layers, until no clear conclusion can emerge. The weight of classification smothers the truth. History offers striking examples. Medieval scholars debated endlessly over how to classify angels, choirs, ranks, subranks, distinctions finer than a hair's breadth. Entire lifetimes were spent in intricate arguments about categories that had no measurable reality. The result was not greater knowledge, but an ornate labyrinth of concepts detached from the world. This is the danger of overclassification. It produces complexity that feels profound but collapses when touched by reality. It fills libraries with words but leaves life unchanged. The corporate world thrives on this. Job titles multiply, departments split into subdepartments, each with their own jargon. A simple process becomes a dozen workflows, each with a hierarchy of categories. Employees lose sight of the purpose, drowning in meetings designed only to maintain the categories themselves. Overclassification becomes self-sustaining. It feeds on its own existence, demanding more detail, more precision, more labels, until nothing can be done without first wading through layers of invented complexity. Psychologists warn that overclassification often hides anxiety. When the world feels uncertain, we create categories to feel control. The more we classify, the more we believe we understand. But this is a false comfort. It is like endlessly sharpening a knife that never cuts, polishing labels that never reveal. Instead of engaging with reality, we dissect it into so many parts that the living whole is lost. It is an illusion of mastery, a wall of categories protecting us from the simplicity we fear. Even in science, where classification has immense value, the trap emerges. Consider debates about what counts as a planet. Pluto was first included, then excluded, then reconsidered, all because categories were redefined and subdivided. The celestial body itself never changed, only the classification did. Humans argued over labels while the reality remained indifferent. Overclassification is the art of mistaking our systems of order for the truth itself. The danger lies not only in wasted effort, but in paralysis. When every issue is split into countless layers, no action can be taken. Imagine a firefighter pausing to classify flames by temperature, color, chemical composition, and spread patterns before lifting the hose. By the time the categories are settled, the house is gone. Overclassification paralyzes decision-making, burying urgency under the weight of invented detail. The world burns while we argue over labels. And yet, it feels safe. Overclassification seduces us because it creates the illusion of expertise. The more categories you name, the more intelligent you appear. The more subdivisions you invent, the more sophisticated your argument seems. But sophistication without clarity is a mirage. It does not bring us closer to truth. It only blinds us with the glare of unnecessary complexity. To break free requires courage. The courage to strip away layers and see the simplicity beneath. To ask, does this category reveal something real, or does it only decorate the surface? To recognize that not every distinction matters, not every difference deserves its own name. Wisdom lies not in multiplying labels, but in knowing which categories serve understanding and which only serve themselves. The truth is that life is often simpler than the structures we build around it. A problem is still a problem, even if divided into 100 subcategories. A human is still a human, even if described by a dozen typologies. The danger of overclassification is that it convinces us the map is the territory, the label is the truth, the subdivision is the solution. But real understanding begins when we step through the layers and face reality itself, simple, raw, and unadorned by the cages of invented complexity. Moving target defense. Imagine chasing something through a fog. Every time you get close, it shifts, steps sideways, changes shape. That is what happens in conversation when someone uses moving target defense. You ask a direct question, you corner a claim, you finally provide the evidence that should settle the debate, and then, just as clarity arrives, the criteria change. The ground beneath your feet moves. The target you thought you hid is suddenly declared irrelevant, not what I meant, or missing the real point. It is not a path to truth. It is an escape route built into the argument itself. At first, this tactic feels subtle. You may not even notice it happening. You challenge someone's claim. Show me proof this policy works. They give one piece of evidence. You examine it, point out the flaws, and reveal that it doesn't hold up. Instead of admitting the point, they say, well, it's not about proof, it's about principles. The game has shifted. You aimed at one target, but they've already moved it, leaving your rebuttal swinging at empty air. And because human conversation is linear, by the time you realize the target has shifted, the new rules are already in play. This tactic is devastating in political debates. A candidate might be asked, did this law actually lower crime? They present numbers. Critics respond, showing the numbers are misleading. Instead of conceding, the politician pivots. It's not just about numbers. It's about sending a message of safety. The measurable claim has now become an emotional one, immune to data. The original question dies in silence, while the conversation continues on new, murkier ground. This is moving target defense, never letting the conversation pin you down. You can see it in personal arguments too. Imagine a couple fighting. One partner says, "You never listen to me." The other responds, "Okay, give me an example." An example is given. It's acknowledged. But instead of addressing it, the partner says, "Well, that's not the point. The real issue is that you don't respect me." The terrain shifts from listening to respect to some other horizon. The target never stays still long enough for resolution. The conversation becomes a maze, each turn leading not to truth, but to exhaustion. Psychologists note this as a form of goalpost shifting. The human mind craves progress in dialogue. We want to reach conclusions, tie knots, settle disputes. But the moving target strategy denies closure. It weaponizes that craving by ensuring the finish line is always pushed a little further away. This leaves the opponent not only frustrated but drained, often giving up entirely. The one shifting the target wins not by being right, but by being impossible to corner. In history, you can trace this tactic in propaganda. Governments under pressure often shift definitions to avoid accountability. When confronted with economic failure, they change the metric of success. Growth is no longer measured by wealth per person, but by infrastructure projects. When asked about freedom, they no longer define it as the right to speak, but as the right to obey a higher order. Each time a critic addresses the claim, the meaning mutates, leaving critics chasing smoke. What once was measurable becomes abstract. What once was specific becomes symbolic. The target moves until truth cannot land a blow. Corporate PR teams use it as well. A company accused of dangerous products might first argue, "There's no evidence of harm." When evidence is produced, they pivot. The evidence isn't conclusive. When conclusive studies arrive, they shift again. It's about personal choice and responsibility. The target changes shape at every stage, not because the company seeks truth, but because it seeks survival. The result is the same: endless argument, no resolution, the illusion of debate without the weight of accountability. Even in philosophy and religion, this tactic emerges. A critic may ask for proof of a claim. The believer offers an explanation. When it's challenged, the claim evolves, not abandoned, just reframed in more abstract terms. Each counterargument leads not to collapse, but to metamorphosis. The belief survives by transforming, by never allowing itself to be tested on fixed ground. Like water, it flows around every obstacle, not by strength, but by refusing to stay still. The danger of moving target defense is not just rhetorical, it is existential. When the ground of discussion constantly shifts, truth itself becomes impossible to grasp. The tactic does not merely protect individuals from losing arguments. It erodes the very idea that arguments can be settled at all. It breeds cynicism, teaching people that dialogue is endless, evidence useless, and clarity unattainable. The target never stays still, so the arrow never lands. And when arrows cannot land, lies and truth look indistinguishable. So what do you do when you encounter this defense? You must refuse to chase. The temptation is to follow every shift, every reframing, every new horizon. But the power lies in anchoring the conversation to the original point. No, this is what we were discussing. Let's answer that first. It takes discipline. It takes patience. But it is the only way to stop the target from escaping into fog. Because if you do not notice the shift, you will spend hours, days, even years chasing moving shadows while the truth slips further and further away. The moving target defense may look like conversation, but it is not. It is evasion dressed as dialogue. It is an argument that never intends to end. And if you do not recognize it, you risk mistaking motion for progress, words for truth, noise for resolution. To see the tactic clearly is the first step in disarming it. To refuse the shifting ground is the only way to stand firm. And in a world where truth is already fragile, anchoring yourself to clarity may be the only defense against the endless game of chasing targets that were never meant to be caught. Over-precision blur. Imagine someone standing at a podium, voice steady, numbers rolling off their tongue like bullets from a machine. 97.3% of citizens support this policy. Our product reduces stress by exactly 41.8%. The risk is only 0.0047%. These numbers sound precise. They sound scientific. They sound true. And yet, beneath the sharpness of decimals often hides a blur of meaning. This is the tactic of over-precision blur, where hyperspecific numbers dazzle the mind but distract from the hollowness of the claim. Our brains love precision. A rounded figure feels soft, uncertain, like guesswork. But tack on a decimal, and suddenly it feels carved in stone. This is why advertising thrives on over-precision. Think of a shampoo brand claiming their formula makes hair 37% shinier. How could anyone possibly measure that? What is shine quantified in? Lumens? Reflections per strand? The number exists not to clarify, but to hypnotize. The decimal gives the illusion of rigor, while the meaning evaporates upon inspection. You are left with confidence in a figure that means nothing. Politicians wield this weapon with alarming skill. Instead of saying, crime has gone down, they will say, crime has been reduced by 13.6% in the last fiscal quarter. It sounds authoritative, but often the measurement window is cherry-picked, the definition of crime selectively adjusted, the numbers stripped of context. A drop of 13.6% may mean fewer petty thefts recorded, while violent crime continues to rise. But the hyper-specific percentage blinds the audience. The fog of precision makes the listener forget to ask the harder questions. What crimes? Over what period? Compared to what baseline? The corporate world is drenched in this blur. Pharmaceutical companies, when pressed about effectiveness, release numbers like, this drug improves outcomes by 12.47%. Without understanding whether that number reflects absolute risk or relative risk, patients are deceived. If a disease affects 2 in 10,000 people, and the drug lowers that to 1 in 10,000, the relative improvement is 50%, but the real improvement is almost nothing. And yet, 50% improvement makes headlines, while lives are swayed by the illusion of precision. Numbers without context are not truth. They are weapons. Even in history, over-precision has been a cloak. During wartime, governments would report hyper-specific casualty figures, often to create the impression of accuracy and control. A general might announce 2,481 enemy combatants neutralized, while in reality, the chaos of the battlefield made such exact numbers impossible. The precision was propaganda. It gave the public the feeling of mastery, of measurable progress, even when the truth was unknowable. In this way, the numbers were not facts. They were instruments of reassurance. Psychologists explain this with a concept called precision bias. The human mind assigns greater trust to specific numbers, even when the underlying data is no better than a rough estimate. A person is more likely to believe a claim that gas prices will rise by 8 cents per gallon than a claim that they will rise by less than 10 cents, even if both mean the same thing. The extra precision feels scientific, even when it adds no clarity. In courtroom studies, jurors have been shown to find expert testimony more credible when the witness uses decimals, even if the conclusions are flimsy. Numbers dazzle, logic disappears. Over-precision also poisons personal life. Consider arguments in relationships. Someone might say, you ignored me for exactly 11 days and 6 hours, as if the timestamp carries more weight than the reality of neglect. The specificity does not change the truth of the wound, but it creates a false sense of objectivity. It reframes emotion into calculation, blurring the core issue with the seduction of numbers. The precision becomes a shield to avoid the rawness of feeling. The danger of over-precision blur is not that numbers are false, but that they seduce us away from asking what they actually mean. A statistic can be both true and meaningless. A decimal can be both accurate and irrelevant. And yet, when delivered with confidence, these numbers carve themselves into memory more deeply than vague truths. The listener walks away convinced, not of understanding, but of certainty. You see it in climate debates too. Critics of environmental policy sometimes throw out figures like, this regulation will cost exactly 2.73 million jobs. Where did the number come from? Often, it is an economic model riddled with assumptions, projections stacked on projections. The hyper-precision hides the truth. No one can predict such a number with accuracy. But to the public, the decimal feels irrefutable. The fog spreads, the argument stalls, and the damage continues. And yet, numbers themselves are not the enemy. Precision matters when it illuminates rather than obscures. Scientific measurement, financial audits, engineering, these depend on careful calculation. But when precision becomes decoration, when it is weaponized to mask uncertainty, it ceases to be clarity and becomes deception. The challenge is not to distrust numbers, but to distrust numbers that refuse to explain themselves. So the next time you hear a claim wrapped in decimals, pause. Ask what the number means. Ask what it leaves out. Ask whether the extra decimal sharpens the truth or smothers it. Because not all clarity comes from detail. Sometimes, detail is only the fog that keeps you from seeing what was obvious all along. Predictive smokescreen. Imagine a leader standing before a crowd, not answering for today's failures, but painting visions of tomorrow's greatness. The present is filled with problems, but instead of accountability, they offer prophecy. They tell you not to judge the broken road beneath your feet, because in the future there will be highways of gold. They deflect criticism with predictions. This is the predictive smokescreen, the tactic of claiming authority over the future in order to escape responsibility for the present. At first, it sounds inspiring. Promises of what is to come have always stirred human hearts. Tomorrow is fertile ground for hope, and hope blinds us to the cracks we stand on today. A politician who cannot justify today's corruption points instead to tomorrow's prosperity. A corporation under fire for environmental damage promises that new technologies will fix everything later. A leader who cannot explain their mistakes insists history will vindicate them. The predictive smokescreen is effective precisely because it hides accountability in a place no one can test, the future. Consider how often this tactic appears in politics. When pressed about current failures, unemployment, corruption, inequality, leaders pivot. They say, yes, things are hard now, but tomorrow, under my vision, everything will change. And if tomorrow arrives and the promises fail? No matter. Another tomorrow is invoked, another vision laid out. Accountability is endlessly postponed. Criticism becomes irrelevant because the argument is never about the present. It is always about the invisible horizon just out of reach. Think about corporations. A company under fire for toxic waste might announce ambitious sustainability goals. By 2050, we will be carbon neutral. The date is far enough away that no one alive today will hold the executives accountable. The crisis of now dissolves into the haze of future promises. The smokescreen does not solve the issue. It buries it beneath the weight of prediction. History offers examples too. During wars, leaders often predicted that sacrifices today would lead to triumph tomorrow. One more push, one more year, and we will see victory. Sometimes they were right, but often the predictions were shields to protect them from admitting failure or from acknowledging the suffering of the moment. Soldiers and civilians bore the cost while leaders pointed toward a better future that never arrived. The smokescreen of prophecy excused present pain in the name of imagined glory. Even in personal lives, this tactic appears. A partner who refuses to change bad behavior insists, in the future, things will be better. You'll see. A boss who underpays workers says, stay loyal now, and later the rewards will come. The accountability for today's actions is always shifted onto a timeline that never seems to materialize. The promise of later becomes a shield for the failures of now. The psychology behind this is simple. Humans are wired to invest in the future. We are creatures of hope. We prefer to believe that pain has purpose, that suffering leads to reward, that today's chaos will transform into tomorrow's order. The predictive smokescreen exploits that hope. It tells us that to question the present is to lack faith in the future. It silences dissent by painting doubt as negativity, realism as betrayal. If you demand accountability now, you are told you are short-sighted, unable to see the bigger picture. Ask yourself, how many times have you heard promises that stretched just far enough into the future that they couldn't be tested? How many times have leaders assured us, history will prove me right, while ignoring the damage they caused in the present? How many times have corporations pledged distant reforms while profiting from immediate harm? The smokescreen is not just a lie, it is a trap. By anchoring accountability to the future, it removes it from the only place it truly exists, here and now. The danger of predictive smokescreens is that they breed cycles of inaction. Problems that require urgency, climate change, inequality, corruption, are delayed, smoothed over with promises of future solutions. Action is paralyzed by prophecy. By the time the future arrives, it is too late. The predictions that once silenced critics evaporate, and new ones take their place. Responsibility is forever postponed, accountability forever dodged. The tactic also reshapes memory. When the promised future fails to appear, the smokescreen shifts. Leaders claim they never promised, or that their words were misinterpreted, or that unseen enemies delayed progress. The failure of prophecy is never admitted. It is rewritten, redefined, reshaped into yet another prediction. The cycle repeats, and each time, trust in truth erodes. People stop believing in accountability altogether. But perhaps the most chilling part of the predictive smokescreen is how willingly people accept it. We want to believe in tomorrow. We want to think things will improve. We want to cling to promises of salvation, prosperity, and vindication. The tactic thrives not only because it is manipulative, but because it feeds something inside us, our hunger for hope, our fear of despair. It is easier to accept a golden future than to confront a broken present. The antidote is not to abandon hope, but to anchor it. To demand that visions of tomorrow be matched by responsibility today. To ask not just what will happen, but what is happening now. To resist the fog of prediction by demanding concrete action in the present. Without that vigilance, the smokescreen will always win, blinding us with promises that never materialize. So the next time someone points beyond the horizon and says, "Don't worry, tomorrow will prove me right," pause. Ask, what about today? What about the pain, the damage, the failures already here? For the future is always untested, always unprovable, always safe ground for prophecy. But the present is undeniable. And if someone cannot answer for it, then no vision of tomorrow should shield them from accountability today. Probability misdirection. Picture a coin flipping in the air. You know it could land on heads or tails, yet someone assures you with supreme confidence that it's 80% certain to be heads. The words sound scientific, backed by the authority of numbers, but beneath the surface, the truth hasn't changed. The outcome is still uncertain. This is probability misdirection, the art of using statistics not to clarify, but to manipulate, to dress uncertainty in the costume of inevitability. It feels like certainty, but it's really a gamble hidden behind percentages. Humans are easily seduced by numbers. We crave precision, something solid to cling to in a chaotic world. There's a 70% chance of rain today. That sounds comforting, right? Yet the reality is simple. It might rain, or it might not. The number only reflects patterns of past data, not the decision of the sky itself. But we interpret it differently. We carry umbrellas, cancel plans, prepare as though certainty has been declared. Numbers bypass our doubt and slide straight into our trust. And those who understand this know how to exploit it. In politics, probability misdirection thrives. A candidate's campaign might declare, "Studies show I have a 90% chance of winning." But what does that really mean? Polls are fragile snapshots, subject to biases, missing voices, shifting moods. A single scandal, a sudden event, or even weather on election day can rewrite the story. Yet the number creates an aura of inevitability, pushing supporters into confidence and opponents into resignation. The battle isn't won with reality. It's won with probability dressed as prophecy. Consider casinos. They are temples of probability misdirection. Slot machines flash statistics about high payout percentages, like 96%. The implication is that you're almost certain to win. But the truth hides in the details. That 96% refers to long-term averages spread across millions of spins, not your unlucky handful of attempts. For you, the gambler in that moment, the chances are just as merciless as ever. But the phrasing, the illusion of certainty, keeps you seated, keeps you feeding the machine, convinced that probability is on your side. Medicine is another arena where probability can mislead. A doctor may tell a patient, "You have a 90% survival rate with this procedure." That sounds like a guarantee. But for the individual facing surgery, the outcome is binary, survival or not. 90% survival for the group does not equal certainty for the person. Yet the way the statistic is framed changes everything. People feel reassured, or they feel doomed, based on a number that cloaks uncertainty in false armor. The psychological trap is this: humans mistake probability for destiny. When told something has a 90% chance, we anchor our expectations to the higher number, ignoring the lurking 10%. If someone says there's only a 5% risk, we treat that as if the danger doesn't exist at all, until it does. This is how we get blindsided. We think probability removes uncertainty, but in reality, it only quantifies it. And the gap between numbers and truth becomes the perfect space for manipulation. Advertisers wield this tool expertly. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this toothpaste. The phrasing suggests overwhelming certainty, yet it hides questions. Who were these dentists? How many were asked? Were they paid? What does recommend even mean in context? The number is less about truth and more about persuasion. And because humans respond instinctively to statistics, the trick works. At its darkest, probability misdirection becomes a tool of mass manipulation. Governments, corporations, and media outlets often frame data in ways that nudge public perception towards certainty that doesn't exist. During financial crises, for example, leaders may declare, "There's only a 10% chance of collapse." To the public, that feels safe, dismissible. But in reality, a 10% chance of collapse is catastrophic. It's a live grenade passed off as a harmless toy. By minimizing or exaggerating percentages, those in power control how we interpret risk. The danger is not in probability itself, it's in forgetting what it represents. Numbers are maps of uncertainty, not declarations of fate. To use them honestly is to admit complexity. To use them dishonestly is to exploit human longing for certainty. And every time probability is framed as certainty, trust erodes. People learn to distrust experts, statistics, even truth itself, because they've been misled too many times by numbers that promised stability but delivered chaos. So the next time you hear a percentage, pause. Ask yourself, does this number describe a possibility, or is it being sold to me as destiny? Who benefits from the way it's framed? What does the number leave out? By questioning the numbers, by remembering that probability is not certainty, you take back the power hidden in the misdirection. Because the truth is this: the world is built on uncertainty. No statistic can erase it. And when you see through the illusion, when you refuse to be lulled into false certainty, you become harder to control, harder to mislead. You reclaim the one thing probability tries to obscure. That uncertainty, frightening as it may be, is also the most honest thing we have. Overqualifying truth. Imagine someone saying, "In most cases, under certain conditions, depending on the context, what I am about to say is probably true, unless, of course, there are exceptions I haven't mentioned." By the time the sentence ends, nothing remains solid. You have heard words, but you have not been given truth. This is the trap of overqualifying truth, where statements are smothered with so many disclaimers, caveats, and hedges that they can neither be proven wrong nor proven right. The idea becomes untouchable, not because it is strong, but because it has been wrapped in so much padding that it cannot be pierced. We have all seen this in everyday life. Someone says, "I'm not saying it's definitely this way, but in many situations, with some exceptions, it could possibly be interpreted like that." On the surface, it sounds careful. It feels cautious, nuanced. But in reality, it leaves you with nothing to hold on to. The speaker has constructed a fortress of vagueness, where every possible challenge is neutralized before it can even be raised. If you disagree, they can retreat to the safety of, "I never said it was always true." If you agree, they nod, as if validated. Either way, the truth itself slips away, untouched. Politicians are masters of this. When asked a direct question, they respond with a cloud of qualifiers. Well, in certain scenarios, depending on the data we have at the time, and acknowledging that the situation is fluid, I believe it could be possible. By the time they finish, they have said nothing concrete. They cannot be held accountable because their words were never anchored. Overqualification is not about honesty, it is about survival. It allows someone to appear intelligent and cautious while never taking the risk of being wrong. Academia, too, is fertile ground for this habit. Research papers are often filled with hedges, suggests, appears, may indicate, within certain parameters, likely under specific conditions. Of course, caution is sometimes necessary. But when every statement is wrapped in disclaimers, the findings lose their weight. Truth dissolves into fog. Instead of guiding, it hesitates. Instead of illuminating, it dims. The desire to never be proven wrong becomes stronger than the courage to propose something bold. Even in personal relationships, the overqualification layer can poison communication. Someone might say, "I think I love you," in some ways, depending on how you define love, and only under certain circumstances where it feels mutual. Such words do not comfort. They confuse. They strip intimacy of clarity, replacing certainty with endless conditions. The other person is left not with a declaration of love, but with a puzzle, a riddle that can never be solved. Overqualifying truth is not just a habit of speech. It is a way of hiding, of keeping vulnerability at arm's length. The psychology behind it is revealing. Humans fear being wrong. To state something boldly is to take a risk, to stand on solid ground where others may prove you mistaken. Overqualification is a defense mechanism. It allows someone to float in a space where they can never be pinned down. If attacked, they slip sideways, pointing out the nuance. If supported, they accept agreement. But in both cases, they remain untouchable because their truth was never sharp enough to pierce reality. It is a shield made of fog, soft and formless, impossible to grasp. History shows us the cost of this trap. Leaders who refused to take a stand, who spoke in endless hedges, often left their societies paralyzed. During moments of crisis, hesitation becomes deadly. A general who says, "We should probably," in most cases, under the right weather conditions, consider attacking, if it seems like the right option, is not leading. They are hiding. The soldiers hear words, but no command. The moment is lost. The enemy advances. Overqualification can be as dangerous as recklessness because it disguises inaction as wisdom. And yet, this trap is seductive because it feels safe. The overqualified statement appears intelligent, sophisticated, nuanced. It avoids the black and white certainty that can seem simplistic. But clarity is not the same as oversimplification. A truth that cannot be tested is not a truth at all. It is an evasion. The overqualified speaker hides behind endless caveats, thinking they have protected themselves, when in reality, they have stripped their words of all power. Think of science again. The greatest breakthroughs were not hedged into oblivion. Newton did not say, "Objects may, in most cases, under the right conditions, possibly attract one another in ways that could be interpreted as gravitational pull." He said, boldly, that gravity is a universal law. Darwin did not hide behind endless caveats when he proposed evolution. They risked being wrong, because only bold truth can transform the world. Overqualification kills that possibility. It leaves us with endless maybes, but no vision. Even in ordinary arguments, the tactic can be manipulative. Someone says, "I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm also not saying you're right, and it really depends on how you define wrong and right." The conversation becomes a swamp. Nothing moves forward, nothing is resolved. Overqualification doesn't just protect the speaker, it imprisons the listener. It leaves them stranded in ambiguity, unable to grasp a point that could be debated or challenged. That is the quiet cruelty of this trap. It silences truth by smothering it in endless conditions. To escape this, one must dare to speak plainly. To say, "This is what I believe," even if it risks being torn apart. To strip away the endless disclaimers and stand on solid ground. Because truth, to have meaning, must risk being wrong. It must be testable, fragile, vulnerable. Only then can it be sharpened, refined, strengthened. Overqualification may shield the ego, but it starves the world of clarity. And in that starvation, both speaker and listener suffer. The danger of overqualifying truth is not only that it hides clarity, it also hides courage. It is easier to hedge, to blur, to smother your words with disclaimers, than to stand in the open and risk failure. But progress, love, knowledge, justice, all require boldness. They require statements strong enough to be tested, strong enough to break if false, strong enough to guide if true. Without that, we are left with shadows of meaning, endless clouds that never rain, endless lamps that never light. So the next time you hear someone speak with layer upon layer of disclaimers, ask yourself, what is left at the core? Is there a truth here, or only fog? Because only by stripping away the hedges do we find out whether the statement holds. And only by daring to be wrong do we ever come close to being right. Knowledge shielding. Imagine standing before someone who knows the answer you seek, someone with authority, credentials, expertise. You ask the question directly, and instead of clarity, you are told, that information is too complex for you to understand. Or worse, trust me, I know best. This is knowledge shielding, the act of withholding key information under the guise of expert discretion. It is the subtle art of controlling truth by deciding what the listener should or should not know, all while cloaking the omission in an air of superiority, benevolence, or professionalism. On the surface, it feels protective. Doctors withholding a grim prognosis so as not to alarm the patient. Governments restricting sensitive reports for national security reasons. Corporations keeping data hidden to prevent unnecessary panic. But look deeper, and you'll see the darker motive. Knowledge shielding is often less about protection and more about power. To decide what information is withheld is to control what reality others are allowed to perceive. History is littered with examples. Consider the nuclear age. In the mid-20th century, governments conducted atomic tests, exposing soldiers and civilians to radiation. When sickness spread, officials assured people there was nothing to worry about. Reports were classified, data hidden, dangers minimized. They claimed the public wouldn't understand the science, that revealing the truth would cause chaos. But this shielding wasn't about clarity, it was about avoiding accountability. Lives were sacrificed not only to radiation, but to silence. Or take the tobacco industry. For decades, internal research showed the addictive and deadly effects of smoking. Executives and scientists inside the corporations knew the truth. Yet when pressed, they withheld, they softened, they deflected. The science isn't settled. The data is too complicated for the general public. This was knowledge shielding at its most destructive. Millions dead while the truth sat hidden in locked filing cabinets under the seal of corporate discretion. Even in everyday life, the tactic appears in quieter forms. A financial advisor who hides risky details under a fog of jargon, telling clients, "You wouldn't grasp the intricacies, just trust my strategy." A teacher who refuses to explain certain perspectives, claiming it's not relevant for students at your level. A manager who withholds critical project information, insisting it would only confuse the team. Each time, the justification sounds reasonable, but the effect is the same. Someone's understanding of reality has been narrowed, not by their own limitations, but by someone else's choice. Psychologists see this as a play on authority bias. People naturally trust those who appear more knowledgeable. When the expert says, "You wouldn't understand," most of us don't push back. We defer, we surrender. The shield works because it taps into our instinct to respect expertise, even when it is used as a weapon rather than a tool. And over time, this conditioning creates dependency. People learn to accept what they're told, not what they know. The most insidious part of knowledge shielding is that it often dresses itself as kindness. A parent hiding the truth from a child for their own good. A doctor refusing to disclose side effects to keep the patient hopeful. A government censoring information to preserve social harmony. But kindness can be a mask. Beneath it lies the raw truth. Those in power decide who gets to see reality and who must live in curated ignorance. You can see it today in technology. Big tech companies shield knowledge about how algorithms work, how data is used, how privacy is traded. When asked, they respond with phrases like, "That's proprietary," or "The system is too complex to explain." In truth, much of it could be explained, But shielding ensures that the public remains dependent, unaware, and ultimately powerless. The less you know, the less you can resist. Knowledge shielding is not always malicious, but it is always dangerous. Sometimes the intention truly is to protect. A doctor may hide the worst because they want to preserve hope. A government may delay releasing information to prevent chaos. But even then, the effect is corrosive. People sense the gap. They feel the silence. And silence breeds distrust. What is hidden becomes larger than what is known. And in that void, speculation, paranoia, and conspiracy thrive. The deepest danger is this. Once people accept knowledge shielding as normal, they stop asking. They learn to defer. They surrender their right to know. And in that surrender, power becomes unchecked. A society that trusts blindly in expert discretion is a society where truth can be managed, sculpted, erased. So how do you defend against it? By recognizing the shield when it appears. When someone says, "It's too complex for you," ask them to explain anyway. When they say, "Trust me, I know best," ask for proof. Push back against the silence, not with aggression, but with persistence. Because the moment you stop questioning is the moment the shield hardens and the truth slips permanently out of reach. Knowledge shielding thrives on the illusion that ignorance is safety. But ignorance is not safety, it is vulnerability. The shield may protect for a moment, but it enslaves for a lifetime. To pierce it, you must demand clarity, even when it feels uncomfortable. Because behind every withheld answer lies a truth that someone, somewhere, decided you should not see. Graph distortion. Picture this. You're watching the evening news, and a graph flashes on the screen. The line plunges downward, sharp and terrifying. Panic ripples through your chest. But look closer, if you dare. The axis starts not at 0, but at 95. The drop that looks catastrophic is really just a tiny shift. This is graph distortion, one of the most insidious tricks in the arsenal of persuasion. Numbers may not lie, but visuals can bend them until the truth disappears in plain sight. Graph distortion thrives on the fact that most of us are visual learners. We don't remember raw data. We remember images, curves, bars, and pie slices. A chart has the power to bypass skepticism and burn a story into memory. And because of that, visuals are the perfect place to smuggle in deception. Change the scale, stretch the axis, crop the timeline, and suddenly a flat line becomes a crisis, or a slow disaster looks like progress. The information hasn't changed, only the frame. But the perception shifts completely. Think of stock markets. A company's share price may rise from $100 to $102. Barely a change. But with a graph zoomed in and the axis shrunk, the line rockets skyward as if fortunes doubled overnight. Investors feel the rush of opportunity, even though the reality is minuscule. On the flip side, a minor dip can be exaggerated into what looks like freefall, sparking panic selling. Billions can move not on reality, but on the illusion of a line. This is not analysis. It is performance art with numbers as props. Politics is drenched in these distortions. Imagine a government boasting about unemployment dropping dramatically. They roll out a bar chart showing a huge fall. But look carefully. The y-axis begins at 95%, not 0%. The bars are only inches apart, but the scale makes them look like cliffs. Suddenly, a tiny decrease becomes historic progress. Conversely, when attacking an opponent, that same government might zoom in on an increase in debt, stretching the graph so that a 2% rise looks like the nation is collapsing. The numbers never lie, but the picture does. History carries haunting lessons of this tactic. In propaganda campaigns during wartime, governments often used maps and charts that exaggerated victories and minimized losses. A battle where thousands died could be framed as a strategic success through graphics showing territory gained, ignoring the blood cost beneath. People absorbed the image of victory, not the reality of devastation. The chart became more powerful than truth itself. Even in health debates, graphs are twisted into weapons. Consider the vaccine controversies. Activists have circulated charts where the timeline was cropped to make it appear that disease rates fell before vaccines were introduced. By slicing off decades of data, they created the illusion that vaccines had no effect. The numbers were real, but the framing told a false story. And for those who never questioned it, the distortion became their reality. The psychological power of graph distortion lies in trust. We are taught to trust visuals, to believe seeing is believing. But our brains are not designed to interrogate axis scales or data density. A bar twice as tall feels like twice the reality, even if it represents only a 1% change. A pie chart wedge colored red feels dangerous, even if it's a sliver. Colors, angles, and framing do not just illustrate, they manipulate. And when paired with authority, graphs can push entire populations into belief without a single question asked. Corporations use this constantly in marketing. A beverage company might show that their product cuts sugar intake by 50%. The chart will show one bar twice the size of the other, screaming victory. But in reality, the sugar went from 2 grams to 1 gram. The difference is insignificant, but the image screams transformation. The visual narrative overwhelms the actual scale. Consumers walk away with certainty, not truth. And it doesn't stop there. News outlets play the same game. They know an alarming graph grabs more attention than a balanced one. A stretched timeline can make a temporary dip look like a long-term collapse. A truncated scale can turn a stable trend into a terrifying jagged roller coaster. The motive is simple. Fear and drama hold eyes longer than accuracy. And in this distortion, trust erodes, but ratings rise. The danger is not just in one misleading chart, but in the erosion of our ability to believe anything. When people catch on to distortion, they swing into cynicism. All graphs lie. And in that void, truth becomes just another opinion. This collapse of trust is the true victory of distortion. It does not need to convince you of a lie. It only needs to convince you that truth can no longer be seen. And yet, graphs are not evil. Done honestly, they can illuminate reality more powerfully than words alone. A clean, accurate chart can show the arc of progress, the weight of crisis, the pattern in chaos. But dishonesty turns them into fog. The trick is vigilance, to ask where the axis starts, what the colors imply, what the scale hides. To remember that a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but only if it is drawn honestly. So the next time a graph flashes before your eyes, pause. Don't just see the line. See the frame around it. Ask what was cropped, stretched, exaggerated. Ask what story the numbers truly tell when stripped of decoration. Because the truth does not fear context, but distortion always does. The blur of a graph is not in the data, but in the hands that draw it. Over safety rhetoric. Imagine standing up to ask a question, only to be told that your words are harmful, that even raising the issue could cause danger. Suddenly, the debate isn't about ideas anymore. It's about survival. Your perspective is not addressed, your evidence not weighed. Instead, the conversation collapses under a single accusation, that your disagreement itself is unsafe. This is over safety rhetoric, where the language of protection is twisted into a weapon, where safety becomes a shield not for people's well-being, but for shutting down dissent. At its heart, over safety rhetoric works because humans are wired to respond to danger. If someone yells fire in a crowded theater, the truth doesn't matter. People panic, people run. The accusation alone controls the outcome. In debate, the same principle applies. Label an idea as dangerous, and the details don't need to be addressed. It's an emotional short circuit, pulling the audience's attention away from logic and toward fear. History has shown how powerful this tactic can be. In authoritarian regimes, dissidents were often branded as threats to stability. Their arguments weren't debated. They were silenced under the claim that their words endangered the public order. During the Red Scare in America, questioning government policy could brand you as a danger to national security, a communist infiltrator. The facts of your argument didn't matter. Over-safety rhetoric worked by collapsing disagreement into danger, making silence the only safe option. You can see echoes of this in workplaces and universities. A student raises a controversial perspective, and instead of engaging with the argument, opponents declare the statement harmful. A colleague questions a company policy, but management frames the dissent as creating a hostile environment. In both cases, the discussion never happens because the label of danger preempts it. The power lies not in proving you wrong, but in making it socially or morally unacceptable to even listen to you. What makes over-safety rhetoric so insidious is that it disguises itself as compassion. Who doesn't want to protect others? Who wants to be accused of causing harm? By framing debate as a safety issue, this tactic manipulates our empathy, turning our instinct to care into a tool for censorship. Yet real safety and rhetorical safety are not the same thing. Real safety shields people from violence. Rhetorical safety shields ideas from scrutiny. And when we confuse the two, debate dies. Psychologically, this tactic exploits a deep bias, our aversion to risk. People will avoid even the possibility of causing harm, even if the harm is exaggerated or imagined. That's why over-safety rhetoric doesn't need to prove danger. It only needs to suggest it. The suggestion is enough to make bystanders back away, to isolate the challenger, to chill the entire conversation. The irony is that over-safety rhetoric often creates the very harm it claims to prevent. By shutting down debate, it silences voices that might reveal truth, correct injustice, or expose corruption. Consider whistleblowers in industries like healthcare or defense. When they raise concerns, organizations often claim their statements are dangerous misinformation that could harm public trust. But the real danger lies not in the whistleblower's words, but in the attempt to silence them. Over-safety rhetoric becomes a cloak for power, protecting the strong at the expense of the weak. This tactic thrives in environments where fear outweighs curiosity. If audiences accept that disagreement equals danger, then no one dares to question. A culture of silence takes root, where consensus isn't earned through persuasion, but enforced through intimidation. And once that culture settles in, truth itself becomes unsafe to speak. But there's a way to resist. The antidote is to separate ideas from people, to recognize that disagreement is not harm, that questioning is not violence. The presence of debate may feel uncomfortable, but discomfort is not danger, it is growth. Real safety protects people's right to exist. Rhetorical safety, when weaponized, denies their right to think. When you see that distinction, over-safety rhetoric loses its hold. In the end, over-safety rhetoric is a mask. It presents itself as compassion, but beneath the surface it is control. It silences, it intimidates, it twists noble instincts into chains. And the cost is truth. The moment every disagreement is branded as dangerous, we lose the ability to test ideas, to refine knowledge, to discover what is real. We trade freedom for comfort, wisdom for silence. So the next time you hear someone frame disagreement as harm, pause. Ask, is this truly unsafe, or is this simply uncomfortable? Is the goal to protect people, or to protect fragile ideas from scrutiny? In those questions lies the power to dismantle the tactic, to reopen the space for dialogue, and to remember that genuine safety and genuine truth are never in conflict. They both flourish only when debate is allowed to breathe. Information dump shock. Imagine standing under a waterfall, but instead of water, it's words, data, numbers, and facts, all pouring down at once. The pressure is relentless, the force overwhelming. You cannot drink, you cannot absorb, only drown. This is the effect of the information dump shock, when so much information is delivered at once that none of it is processed, and clarity collapses into chaos. At first glance, information seems harmless. After all, knowledge is power. We're taught to crave data, to collect facts, to consume as much as possible. But there is a threshold where information stops enlightening and starts blinding. When details are hurled too quickly, without structure or rhythm, the mind doesn't expand, it locks up. The very act of receiving becomes exhausting, and instead of truth, what we experience is numbness. Think about the way some lectures or presentations unfold. A speaker rattles off statistic after statistic, chart after chart, exception after exception. Their intention may be to appear thorough, but the result is paralysis. You remember fragments, maybe a number or two, but the message is gone. The audience doesn't walk away empowered, they walk away drained. The shock of too much at once ensures that nothing is truly retained. This tactic often appears in politics. A leader confronted with a scandal may respond not with a direct answer, but with an avalanche of data, half-true statistics, tangential facts, irrelevant details. The sheer volume disorients the listener. The scandal is no longer the focus. The audience is left drowning in unrelated numbers, unable to separate what matters from what does not. The truth becomes invisible, buried under an avalanche of noise. History offers its own examples. Consider the propaganda pamphlets of the 20th century, pages filled with charts, figures, obscure references, and endless citations. On the surface, it looked authoritative, impossible to argue against. But this was the trick. The information was not designed to inform, it was designed to overwhelm. By flooding the reader with too much at once, the propagandist ensured the reader's inability to question. When the mind is overloaded, it stops resisting. It simply shuts down. The digital age has magnified this phenomenon to an almost unbearable scale. Social media feeds, breaking news alerts, endless notifications, each one carrying fragments of information, context stripped, detail piled upon detail. Instead of clarity, we experience saturation. And in this saturation, the important truths slip past us unnoticed. The human mind evolved to track the rustle in the grass, the shift in shadows, the stories of a village. It did not evolve to process thousands of data points in a single scroll. The result is shock, numbness, exhaustion disguised as awareness. This tactic is also used in corporate communication. When companies face crises, mass layoffs, scandals, product failures, they often release press statements bloated with information. They detail irrelevant figures, global investments, future projects, technical jargon. The effect is intentional. By overwhelming the reader, the sting of the present failure is blurred. The shock of information replaces the sting of accountability. You can't hold on to outrage when you're too busy trying to process paragraphs of noise. Even in personal life, the effect is recognizable. Someone in an argument floods you with every mistake you've ever made, every flaw, every past failure, all in one breathless assault. You cannot respond to all of it. You cannot process it all. So you freeze. The original disagreement is lost, buried beneath the landslide of grievances. The tactic works not by logic, but by exhaustion. Psychologists describe this effect as cognitive overload. Our working memory has limits. Once exceeded, it doesn't expand, it collapses. Think of it like a glass of water. A little fills it, a little more expands it. But pour too much too quickly, and it overflows. Nothing more is held. When someone uses information dump shock, they rely on this collapse. They don't need to win the argument with reason. They need only to break your ability to reason at all. Ask yourself, how many times have you zoned out during a presentation filled with endless slides? How many times have you read an email so bloated with detail that you gave up halfway through? How many times have you stopped questioning because there was simply too much to question? That is the victory of the information dump, not to persuade, but to silence through overwhelm. The deeper danger is that in this flood, truth and lies mix together indistinguishably. A falsehood wrapped in 100 true statements becomes almost impossible to extract. We are left nodding, exhausted, accepting, not because we agree, but because resistance takes too much effort. And so, manipulation thrives in the flood. Yet there is also a paradox. In an age drowning in information, silence becomes power. Clarity becomes rare. The ability to distill a message into something simple and sharp is more valuable than the ability to bury an audience beneath facts. The antidote to information dump shock is not to reject knowledge, but to demand precision. To separate what matters from what doesn't. To remember that more words are not more truth. So the next time someone hurls a torrent of information at you, whether in a debate, a headline, or a conversation, pause. Step back from the waterfall. Ask, what is the one truth hidden in this flood? What was the original question before the avalanche began? For clarity is not buried in quantity. It is revealed in restraint. And when faced with information dump shock, survival begins with the courage to ignore the noise and listen only for the signal. Time dilution tactic. Imagine being trapped in a meeting that never ends. The topic circles endlessly, details multiply, questions are dragged out one after another. You can feel your focus unraveling, your memory thinning, your patience dissolving. By the time the conclusion arrives, you barely remember what the discussion was supposed to prove. This is the essence of the time dilution tactic, stretching conversations so long that clarity fades, objections dissolve, and resistance collapses under the sheer weight of exhaustion. It is not about winning an argument with strength. It is about dragging it out until the other side has nothing left to give. The tactic works because human attention is finite. Our brains are wired for bursts of focus, not endless marathons of debate. The longer a discussion drags on, the more details blur together, the harder it becomes to recall key points, and the easier it is to forget what mattered most. Psychologists call this cognitive fatigue. By the time hours have passed, the original argument is buried under repetition, detours, and tangents. Memory fades, and in that fog, whoever can endure longest claims victory, not through logic, but through endurance. Think of politics. A senator who wishes to block a vote speaks for hours on end, reading entire books, listing trivial details, dragging time until the chamber is emptied of patience. This is the filibuster, not persuasion, but exhaustion. By the time it ends, the issue has been blurred, the momentum lost. The tactic thrives on fatigue, exploiting the simple fact that people give up before the truth has a chance to emerge. Or consider relationships. Someone confronted with a simple question, "Where were you last night?" responds with an avalanche of words. They recount every detail of their evening, describe who they saw, what they ate, the conversations they overheard. Soon the questioner forgets what they wanted to know, their suspicion drowned in a flood of irrelevant detail. This is time dilution in miniature. The truth is not denied, but buried under so many words that it slips away unseen. Workplaces, too, become battlegrounds of this tactic. A manager who doesn't want to address a problem schedules endless meetings, stretching discussions into hours of circular talk. By the end, no one remembers the original concern. The issue dies, not because it was resolved, but because everyone is too drained to pursue it further. Time has been weaponized into a curtain, behind which accountability disappears. History offers chilling examples. In authoritarian regimes, show trials dragged on for days, exhausting the accused, the audience, and even the record keepers. By stretching the spectacle into unbearable length, the memory of the charges blurred. What remained was not clarity, but exhaustion, an audience too weary to question, a defendant too fatigued to resist. The tactic transforms time itself into a tool of control, erasing truth not by argument, but by duration. The psychology is simple. When discussions drag, the human mind loses its anchor. People begin to nod in agreement simply to escape. Studies show that in negotiations, the party willing to drag the process out often wins concessions, not because their argument is better, but because the other side wants relief. Fatigue masquerades as consent. The time dilution tactic feeds on this weakness, using endurance as a weapon, turning hours into chains. And yet, it is subtle. Unlike obvious deception, this tactic looks harmless. It appears to be thoroughness, patience, depth. The speaker seems committed, willing to cover every angle. But beneath the surface, it is manipulation. The real goal is not to clarify, but to blur, not to illuminate, but to dim. The audience is led through endless loops until their resistance evaporates. By the time the discussion ends, they no longer care who was right. They only care that it is over. You can see this in media, too. A scandal erupts, and instead of addressing it directly, officials drag out endless press briefings, each filled with minor details, technical language, and procedural tangents. Days pass, then weeks. Attention wanes, memory fades, and the urgency evaporates. By the time clarity is possible, the world has already moved on. The time dilution tactic has succeeded, not by answering questions, but by exhausting the will to keep asking them. Even in personal disputes, we use it without realizing. A child, caught in a lie, tells a story so long and convoluted that the parent forgets the original offense. A partner, avoiding responsibility, drags the discussion into endless tangents about the past, about tone, about unrelated grievances. The original issue is diluted until it no longer matters. Time itself becomes a shield, stretching moments into walls of fog. The haunting part is how effective it is. Because unlike other traps of reasoning, time dilution doesn't need to win, it only needs to last. It relies on patience running out, on memory wearing thin. It is the art of burying truth beneath the slow erosion of attention. And once the mind is weary, it will accept almost anything, silence, agreement, even falsehood, just to find an ending. To resist, it requires vigilance. It means recognizing when a conversation has been stretched beyond clarity, when repetition has replaced reasoning, when details have become distractions. It means daring to stop and say, no more. Let's return to the point. It means refusing to let time itself be used as a weapon against truth. The truth is fragile. It does not survive endless dilution. It must be spoken clearly, directly, without being drowned in hours of noise. The time dilution tactic thrives because it knows our weakness, that we tire, that we forget, that we surrender. But once you see it, once you name it, you can resist. You can step out of the endless loop and demand clarity before it fades. Because truth does not live in endless hours. It lives in moments of sharp, undeniable clarity, before the fog of exhaustion can sweep it away. Benchmark shift. Imagine running a race where the finish line keeps moving. One moment it's 100 meters away, the next it's 150, and just as you get close, it's shifted again. No matter how fast you run, you're trapped in a game you can't win. This is the essence of benchmark shift, changing the standards mid-comparison to alter outcomes. It's not about truth, not about fairness, but about bending the rules so that the result always favors whoever controls the standard. And because the shift often hides in subtle adjustments, most people don't even notice until the damage is done. Consider politics. A government promises to cut unemployment, then proudly declares success when the numbers drop. But behind the scenes, the benchmark has shifted. They quietly changed the definition of employment to include part-time workers, gig jobs, or even those working just a few hours a week. The official rate falls, the charts improve, but reality doesn't change. Families still struggle, wages still stagnate. The victory is statistical, not real. The benchmark was moved, and with it, the perception of progress. Corporations use this tactic endlessly. A tech company might boast that their new phone is faster than the competition. But how is speed measured? At launch events, benchmarks are cherry-picked, their phone tested in ideal conditions, the competitors in average ones. Or worse, the standard of comparison changes mid-sentence. One moment it's app loading speed, the next it's battery optimization, the next it's camera rendering. By shifting benchmarks, they control the story. The consumer walks away dazzled, but deceived. History, too, shows this tactic at its darkest. In education systems, governments often shift the criteria for what counts as literacy or passing. In one decade, literacy might mean being able to read a simple passage. In another, it might mean signing your name. Suddenly, literacy rates soar, not because society has transformed, but because the bar was lowered. Citizens see progress where none exists. The benchmark changed, and reality was rewritten. Psychologists recognize this as a cousin of the moving goalposts fallacy. When evidence comes too close to proving someone wrong, they shift the standard of proof. Imagine a debate about climate change. One skeptic demands evidence that global temperatures are rising. When presented with decades of data, they shift the benchmark. Well, prove it's caused by humans. Show them evidence of human impact, and the bar shifts again. Prove it's catastrophic. No matter how much evidence stacks up, the finish line keeps moving. The tactic is not about seeking truth. It is about ensuring truth never arrives. You can see benchmark shift in personal life too. In relationships, someone might demand effort from their partner, more communication, more time, more care. But as soon as the effort is given, the bar moves. Yes, but it wasn't enough. Yes, but not in the way I wanted. The target changes, making satisfaction impossible. This is emotional manipulation dressed up as standards. The partner keeps striving, never realizing the problem is not their effort, but the shifting benchmark. Even in sports, this tactic thrives. A team may dominate by one set of rules, but critics shift the measure of greatness. Yes, they won the championship, but not against strong opponents. Or, yes, they scored the most, but not with the right style. The standard changes not to illuminate truth, but to preserve control of the narrative. The champion is robbed of clarity, trapped in an endless loop of shifting validation. The danger of benchmark shift lies in erosion of trust. When standards are unstable, comparison loses meaning. Progress cannot be measured if the scale keeps changing. Success cannot be celebrated if the bar is moved as soon as it is reached. And accountability collapses when those in power can always redefine what success or failure means. It is a tactic of survival for the guilty, but a prison for the innocent. And yet, this tactic works because it feels subtle. Who notices when the definition of poverty changes from one decade to the next? Who questions when the scoreboard criteria shift mid-season? We are lulled by the appearance of measurement, forgetting to ask whether the measurement itself stayed constant. The numbers look official. The comparisons look legitimate. But without stable standards, the entire exercise is theater. The antidote to benchmark shift is vigilance. Ask, what is the standard being used? Has it changed? Are we comparing the same thing over time, or has the ground quietly moved beneath our feet? Truth requires consistency. Without it, reality becomes a mirage, shifting with every new definition. So the next time you hear bold claims of progress or excuses for failure, pause. Look not at the numbers, but at the ruler being used. Ask whether the finish line has been moved, whether the bar was lowered or raised, whether the game was rigged by shifting terms. Because in a world of benchmark shifts, truth is not in the outcome. It is in the stability of the measure itself. Concept mixing maze. Imagine being led through a labyrinth where every corridor looks the same, where walls bend into one another so seamlessly that you cannot tell where one path ends and another begins. That is the essence of the concept mixing maze, the deliberate blending of separate ideas until they appear as a single, inseparable truth. It is not a mistake. It is a strategy. If you fuse ideas tightly enough, to challenge one piece is to seem as though you are rejecting them all. Think of the phrase, patriotism means supporting the government. Two distinct concepts, love for one's country and loyalty to those in power, have been merged. To question the government is painted as a betrayal of the nation. The maze works because it tangles the concepts so thoroughly that ordinary people, desperate not to appear disloyal, stop asking whether the two ideas were ever meant to be one. The same happens in marketing. A soda company convinces you that happiness equals drinking their product. Suddenly, rejecting the drink is not just about taste. It feels like rejecting joy itself. Health campaigns, advertising, even social movements often deploy the maze. Separate concepts are braided together, then presented as natural, obvious, and unquestionable. Over time, the maze becomes so familiar that no one notices the twisting of ideas. It just feels like reality. In history, the concept mixing maze has been used to control entire societies. In medieval Europe, religion and monarchy were fused into one concept, divine right. To question the king was to question God. Two ideas, spiritual faith and political authority, were merged until they became indistinguishable. In the Cold War, anti-communism was blended with patriotism in many countries, so that those who criticized capitalism were painted as traitors, spies, or enemies of freedom itself. The maze ensures dissent is not just disagreement, it is heresy. You can see it in personal relationships too. A manipulative partner might say, "If you love me, you'll do what I ask." Two separate concepts, love and obedience, are knotted together. The maze makes resistance feel like rejection. The victim begins to believe that their freedom threatens the bond itself. The brilliance of this trap lies in its subtlety. By merging ideas, it becomes impossible to challenge one without being accused of betraying the other. Psychologists explain this tactic as conceptual entanglement. The human mind craves patterns, connections, simplicity. When two ideas are repeated together enough times, they form an unconscious association. Safety equals surveillance. Success equals wealth. Morality equals tradition. Over time, the connection feels natural, inevitable. We stop questioning whether the link was ever real, because in the maze, everything looks connected. Corporations weaponize this constantly. Consider the technology sector. Innovation is often equated with progress, and progress with goodness. Therefore, to question a new device, a new algorithm, or a new system of data collection is painted as being anti-progress. The concepts are fused. Innovation equals progress equals good. By the time you attempt to separate them, you've already been lost in the corridors of the maze. Even in science, the mixing maze appears. Think of how scientific consensus is often blended with absolute truth. In reality, science is a method, a process, a shifting consensus based on evidence. But when critics of dangerous industries raise questions, defenders can hide behind the maze. To question us is to reject science itself. This conflation blurs nuance. painting complex debates in black and white. The most dangerous aspect of the concept mixing maze is how it silences opposition. Once two ideas are fused, anyone who resists one is accused of resisting both. Question surveillance? You don't care about safety. Criticize consumerism? You hate freedom. Refuse obedience? You don't love enough. The maze leaves no exit, only walls built of false equivalences. But if you learn to see it, the maze begins to crumble. Ask, what separate ideas have been tied together? Does one truly require the other? Can patriotism exist without blind obedience? Can love exist without submission? Can progress exist without exploitation? These questions cut threads, break corridors, dismantle the illusion of inevitability. The concept mixing maze works only when people walk it without realizing they are inside. The moment you see the walls for what they are, constructed, artificial, deliberate, you can step out. And outside the maze, truth regains its shape. Concepts stand on their own again, separate, clear, and unmanipulated. The danger lies in forgetting that the maze exists. Because once you accept the blend, once you stop questioning the merge, you no longer see the difference between what was true and what was simply arranged to appear so. And in that moment, the architect of the maze has already won. Goalpost illusion. Imagine playing a game where the rules feel solid, clear boundaries, a defined target, a goal you can see. You put in the effort, you run the race, you aim for the finish line. But just as you're about to cross it, the line shifts. Suddenly, the victory you thought you earned doesn't count, because the standard has changed. This is the goalpost illusion, the art of pretending the criteria are fixed, while secretly moving them whenever convenient. It's one of the most subtle yet devastating manipulations, because it tricks you into chasing certainty in a rigged system. At first glance, the goalposts appear steady. The rules are spelled out, the expectations declared. But hidden behind that appearance is flexibility. Flexibility not for fairness, but for control. Imagine a workplace where your manager tells you, hit these numbers and you'll get promoted. You hit them. Then you're told, actually, we also wanted you to take on leadership roles. You do that. Then suddenly, it's, well, promotions only go to people with advanced degrees. The criteria keep shifting, always just out of reach. The illusion is that the target was fixed all along, but in reality, it was never meant to be caught. History is full of this trick. During the suffrage movement, women were told they couldn't vote because they weren't educated enough. Then, when education was achieved, the argument shifted. Women were too emotional for politics. When that excuse failed, the goalpost moved again, claiming society wasn't ready. Each time one argument was answered, the target shifted to another, keeping the power where it already was. The illusion of fairness cloaked the reality of resistance. You see the same thing in debates. A person argues, show me evidence, and I'll change my mind. Evidence is given. Then suddenly the requirement becomes more evidence, or different evidence, or evidence from only my preferred source. The original demand has shifted, but the illusion is that it was consistent. The opponent never intended to be persuaded. They intended to maintain control by moving the bar. In science communication, this illusion often plays out with denial movements. Take climate change. For decades, skeptics said, there's no warming. When data proved warming, the goalpost shifted. Well, maybe there's warming, but humans aren't responsible. When human influence was undeniable, it shifted again. Even if it's caused by humans, it won't be dangerous. And finally, it's too late to act, so why bother? The goalposts never stay still. They move just enough to keep doubt alive, to stall action, to protect entrenched interests. The psychological damage of the goalpost illusion is enormous. It breeds exhaustion. When people feel the target keeps moving, they stop trying altogether. It creates disillusionment, convincing them the game is unwinnable. And that's exactly the point. By controlling the finish line, manipulators control morale. They hold power not by proving their case, but by ensuring yours can never be proven to their satisfaction. Even in personal relationships, the same pattern emerges. A partner might say, if you really cared, you'd do this one thing. You do it. But then the demand shifts. Actually, you'd also do that. The moving goalpost ensures that validation never arrives. that one person holds the other in a perpetual state of inadequacy. The illusion is that the standard was clear. The reality is that the standard was a mirage. The media exploits this too. Politicians are held to shifting standards depending on who they are. One candidate is excused for scandals because no one's perfect, while another is crucified for a single misstep because the goalpost has been quietly moved. This isn't fairness. It's narrative control, designed to keep the story aligned with the preferred outcome. The brilliance of the goalpost illusion lies in how it disguises itself. On the surface, it looks like rational demand. We just need more proof. We just want higher standards. We just care about consistency. But beneath the surface, it's sabotage, because no amount of proof or standard will ever be enough. The bar is designed to move forever. So how do you resist it? By exposing the shift. By freezing the goalpost where it began. Ask, what will be enough? What exactly are the terms? Make the other person commit to the original conditions before you play the game. And when the bar moves, call it out. That's not what you said before. You're changing the rules. The illusion only works in silence. Once the movement is exposed, the manipulation loses its power. In the end, the goalpost illusion is not about truth, it's about control. It keeps you running endlessly toward a finish line that was never meant to be crossed. But once you see it for what it is, you realize the trap isn't your failure, it's their design. And in that realization, you reclaim the most important thing the illusion tried to steal, the knowledge that you were never inadequate. The game was simply never meant to let you win.